Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Shifting Trails, When the Forest Betrays. I'd been hiking for hours, sunburn creeping under the collar of my shirt, the weight of my pack settling into my shoulders like a familiar ache. I pulled out the map from my jacket pocket, smoothing the crinkled paper with damp fingers. The map was old, at least 5 years, but it was the best I had. I'd printed it from an online resource before the trip, highlighting a loop through the foothills and dense woods of the national park. It should have been straightforward. Follow the trail to the ridge, then descend along the creek back to the trailhead. 3 days, 2 nights, a solo trip to clear my head. The map, however, was confusing me now. I traced my finger along the printed routes, but the terrain around me didn't line up. The trail I'd been following vanished on the map, replaced by a wide stretch of water. I blinked and unfolded the map fully. Where there had once been a clearing marked by a simple patch of beige, a river now cut through the area like a jagged scar. The contour line shifted, 2 hills flattened or steepened in ways I didn't remember encountering. I tucked the map away and looked up, trying to orient myself by the sun. I pulled out my compass, a small but sturdy tool I'd carried since my first backpacking trip years ago. I held it level, the needle twitching, then settling, pointing in a direction that made no sense. The sun, hanging low and unmistakably west, didn't match the compass's reading. If the compass was right, the sun should have been somewhere else entirely. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, the sloping ground, any landmark I recognized. But everything felt off, like the forest had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the compass was faulty. Maybe the map was outdated or I'd taken a wrong turn hours ago. I told myself I was overthinking it. The woods could play tricks on you, especially when you were tired. I checked my watch mid-afternoon, just enough time to reach the ridge before dark if I pushed on. I stuffed the compass and map back into my pack and started walking again, eyes peeled for the junction I'd marked as a waypoint. But the trail was different now. The undergrowth grew thicker, the path less distinct. The familiar markers, the carved tree trunks, the cairns of stacked stones, were missing. I stopped, heart quickening. There was a sound, a faint crunching of leaves behind me. I froze, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was a deer or a squirrel. But the unease lingered. I remembered the ranger's advice before I left: stick to the marked trails. Don't wander off. And if you're ever unsure, don't hesitate to turn back. Turning back felt wrong, though. I was too far in, with no clear sense of where back even was. The forest seemed to close in, shadows lengthening beneath the canopy. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The idea of being lost wasn't new, but this felt different, like the land itself was shifting underfoot, erasing the path I thought I knew. I reached a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath again. The air smelled damp and earthy, but there was something else, an undercurrent of something metallic, faint but unmistakable. I scanned the edges of the clearing, eyes narrowing. There, near a cluster of rocks, I spotted something half buried in the dirt. A worn boot, caked in mud and scuffed beyond recognition. I knelt to examine it. It looked recent, not decades old. Someone else had been here, wandering these woods, maybe lost too. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The wilderness was vast, but not empty. And if the trails were changing, if the land was shifting, then whatever had left that boot might still be out there. I stood slowly, the weight of the afternoon pressing on me. I pulled out my phone to check for signal. Nothing. No bars, no service. Just the unyielding silence of the forest. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched longer, and I realized I was no longer sure which way led out. I wasn't just lost. I was trapped in a wilderness that was rewriting its own map, and I had no idea why. Panic simmered beneath my skin, but I forced it down. Rationality was the only weapon I had left. I scanned the trees, looking for any landmark that might break the monotony, the gnarled oak with its twisted limbs, the jagged rock face I'd passed earlier, but everything seemed to have shifted, as if the forest was playing tricks on me. My breath came out in white clouds, visible now in the chilling dusk. I debated whether to move or stay put. Staying meant enduring the cold and the encroaching darkness. Moving meant risking deeper entanglement in this living maze. I chose motion. Slowly, deliberately, I followed a faint creek I had spotted moments before, reasoning that water often leads to civilization. The creek's murmur was a small comfort in the thickening gloom. Yet as I walked, the landscape warped subtly. Trees that should have been sparse grew dense and tangled. Rocks that once lined the creek vanished or multiplied. It was as if the forest's edges were fluid, dissolving and reforming just beyond my sight. Then, a flicker caught my eye, a faint glow, like a candle in the distance. Hope surged, sharper than any fear. I veered toward it, pushing through thick brambles that clawed at my sleeves and scratched my skin. The light pulsed steadily now, beckoning. As I neared, shapes emerged from the shadows, a small campsite, abandoned but warm. A fire pit still smoldered faintly, embers glowing faint orange, as if someone had only just left. Scattered around were footprints too fresh to be old and a hastily discarded pack. My heart pounded. Whatever had been here had left in a hurry. Had they seen me? Were they still watching? The forest seemed to hold its breath. I grabbed the pack, opening it with trembling fingers. Inside were a compass, a half-empty water bottle, and a tattered map. The map was strange, the ink faded, but the paths drawn didn't match any I knew. Some trails looped impossibly, intersecting in ways that made no sense. Suddenly, a rustle behind me snapped my attention to the present. Footsteps, deliberate and close. I spun around, but the shadows offered no answers, only the shifting trees, and that restless, rewriting wilderness. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they'd started, swallowed by the thick hush of the forest. I didn't want to believe I was alone, but I was painfully aware that the wilderness was no longer the friend I'd thought it to be. The shifting trails, the warped map, the compass that refused to point north, all signs that something was profoundly wrong. And whoever had been here before me had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and an unsettling void. I forced myself to move, stepping away from the campfire's weak glow and back toward the creek. The water, dark and sluggish, wound through the undergrowth like a vein of liquid shadow. I knelt to sip from my bottle, grateful for the cool relief against my parched throat. Then I pulled out the odd map again, spreading it on a flat rock and tracing the impossible lines with a trembling finger. The paths no longer followed the natural topography I'd memorized from earlier in the day. Clearings where I'd paused were now swamped in tangled brush. Ridges had slipped away entirely, replaced by marshes and pools. I tried to reconcile the map with the surroundings, but my sense of direction grew tangled, my confidence eroding with every glance. The sun, when I checked it just hours ago, had set in a position that didn't match any compass reading I knew. Now, in the twilight, the sky was a smudged slate, and I had no reliable way to orient myself. I was a castaway in a sea of trees that twisted, folded, and reshaped themselves around me. If this was a natural phenomenon, it was beyond anything I'd ever heard of. A rustle broke my concentration. My head snapped up, eyes straining into the shadows where the trees leaned like dark sentinels. Something moved, a figure, blurred and shifting between the trunks. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding anew, and called out, voice cracking. Hello? Is someone there? No answer. Just the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps retreating. I hesitated, torn between pursuit and caution. Then I noticed something near the fire pit, half buried beneath a scattering of leaves, a small, folded piece of paper. I reached down and unfolded it carefully, the edges brittle and stained. The note was brief, written hastily in a cramped, uneven script. Don't trust the trails. They lie. Keep to the creek. Avoid the ridge. No signature. No explanation. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever had left this had known what was happening here, or what was happening to the forest. And they tried to warn me. But if the trails were lying, what did that mean? Had the land itself shifted, or was someone manipulating it to trap people? I stuffed the note into my pocket and glanced back along the creek. The water flowed steadily eastward, but the terrain beyond seemed to close in, trees bending unnaturally, as if leaning in to block the way. I turned and started following the creek again, moving carefully, every sense alert. The forest felt alive in a different way now, not with birdsong or rustling leaves, but with subtle menace. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. Branches snapped in the distance, too deliberate to be random. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I stumbled into a clearing I didn't recognize. At its center stood a wooden sign, old and weathered, half sunken into the mossy earth. The faded letters were barely legible, but I could make out the words, Camp 7 Restricted Area. I frowned. I hadn't seen any mention of a Camp 7 on my original map, and the idea of a restricted zone deep in this wilderness sparked a surge of unease. Who had put it there? Was it still inhabited? And why restrict access in a place so remote? I scanned the perimeter. Beneath the overgrowth, I caught glimpses of flattened earth and broken branches, signs someone had been here recently. Then, near the edge of the clearing, I spotted a discarded piece of clothing, a jacket, dark and heavy, snagged on a low branch. I approached cautiously, pulling it free. The fabric was damp and smelled faintly of smoke. Inside a pocket, I found a small notebook, its pages filled with hurried notes and sketches of the shifting trails. The handwriting was different from the note by the fire pit, more methodical but no less anxious. One entry caught my eye. Patterns emerge. Trails realign overnight. The ridge is a trap. Signals intercepted. They're watching. Must keep moving. Who is watching? I whispered to myself, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I felt suddenly exposed, a trespasser in a hidden game I didn't understand. The forest was no longer just a place of trees and rocks, it was a maze layered with invisible eyes and unseen hands. And I was the latest piece, caught in a puzzle I couldn't solve. I stuffed the notebook into my pack and looked back toward the creek. The water's steady murmur was a faint comfort, but the path ahead was uncertain. I had to decide, follow the creek deeper into this labyrinth or try to climb the ridge despite the warnings. Before I could make a choice, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing, a rifle shot, distant but unmistakable. My blood froze. That wasn't wildlife. It was a warning. I dropped to the ground, heart pounding, and scanned the tree-line. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching. And they knew I was here. The forest had already rewritten itself, but now the rules were changing. I wasn't just lost, I was hunted. There was no turning back. The night was restless. I decided to follow the creek, reasoning that water would eventually lead to civilization or at least a road. The old map was useless now. The trails had shifted overnight, rivers where clearings once lay, and the sun no longer behaved as it should, throwing off my compass by several degrees. The forest felt alive but hostile, reshaping itself in a way no natural disaster could explain. As I moved through the undergrowth, I tried to keep my senses sharp. Every rustle, every broken twig put me on edge. The air carried an undercurrent of something else, unease, maybe, or the faintest trace of smoke from distant fires. I wasn't alone here. Whoever had fired that shot, whoever maintained this Camp 7, was watching. I had no doubt. Mid-morning, I stumbled on a narrow trail not marked on my original map, but it seemed well-worn. The ground was packed dirt, and the broken branches along the edge suggested recent passage. I hesitated, then followed it, hoping it might lead to answers. The creek was a faint murmur in the distance, but the trail climbed steadily upward, winding through dense thickets. After about an hour, I caught sight of a clearing framed by jagged rocks. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney built of stacked stones. It was unmistakably a camp, fresh firewood, a few empty cans, and a discarded pair of gloves stained with mud. No signs of recent human presence, like footprints or movement, but the place wasn't abandoned long ago. I crouched behind a fallen log, my heart thudding. Beside the chimney was a weathered crate, stenciled with faded letters, property of RCS. The acronym meant nothing to me, but the crate was filled with supplies, canned food, ration bars, and a portable radio with a cracked antenna. I rifled through the crate quietly and found a small notebook tucked under a loose board. This one was different from the first, neater handwriting, dated just 3 days prior. The entries described a group of men conducting field operations in the area, referencing hostile movements and communication blackouts. There were also mentions of a local militia and warnings to avoid unauthorized personnel. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a wilderness reshaping itself naturally or by some unknown force. This was a controlled environment, manipulated by people. The trail shifted because someone wanted them to, and the sun's misalignment? Likely a malfunction or interference with my compass caused by deliberate electromagnetic activity in the area. Suddenly, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind, low and urgent. I froze, straining to hear. The voices grew louder, punctuated by the metallic clink of gear and the steady crunch of boots on dry leaves. I ducked behind the rocks, heart racing. 3 men emerged into the clearing, armed and alert, scanning the woods as they moved. Their uniforms were rough, patched with insignias I didn't recognize, but their weapons were military grade. One carried a tablet, tapping coordinates that matched some of the notebook's sketches. They spoke in clipped tones, mentioning the tracker and movement detected near the ridge. I pressed myself flat, trying to make out more, but the words were fragments: intercept, extraction, neutralize. This wasn't just a secret camp, it was an operational base for some paramilitary group, possibly linked to local militia or private contractors. The notebook's warnings about being watched weren't paranoia, they were reality. I needed to move, but the trail back to the creek was now a potential trap. The men split up, their search patterns methodical, sweeping the surrounding forest with practiced precision. I counted to 3, then slipped quietly down the rocky slope, following a narrow game trail that led away from the clearing. As I moved, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees crowding the path, branches snagging my clothes. I glanced at my compass again, still spinning erratically, and then at the notebook. The last entries hinted at someone inside the camp who might have been trying to sabotage the operation or escape but had disappeared without a trace. My mind raced. Was that person still alive? Could they be the key to understanding this place? I had to find out, but the men were closing in. Suddenly, a sharp rustle behind me made me freeze. My breath caught, and I slowly turned toward the sound, ready to run or defend myself. Emerging from the shadows was a figure, tall, lean, eyes wary but not hostile. "Quiet," he whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder. "You don't belong here." "Neither do I." He introduced himself as Eli, a former member of the group occupying Camp 7 who had gone dark after witnessing something he couldn't accept. He spoke in clipped sentences, eyes darting nervously as if expecting discovery at any moment. The trails, the shifts, they're designed to keep people out. Or trap them in, he said. You're lucky you found this camp, but now you're in deeper than you realize. They're not just hunting trespassers, they're hunting leaks. I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a stone. Together, we had to navigate this shifting wilderness and the human threats lurking within it. There was no turning back. As we moved silently through the underbrush, Eli glanced at the sky, frowning. They've started using drones. If we don't find a way out soon, they'll spot us. A sudden whirring overhead snapped my head upward. Two small, dark shapes cut through the treetops, drones, scanning, searching. The forest was no longer just a maze of shifting trails. It was a battlefield, and I was in the crosshairs. We broke into a run. We ran without looking back, the underbrush tearing at our clothes, branches whipping across our faces. Split up, he hissed suddenly, pulling me to a halt behind a fallen log. They can't track two targets at once if we're far enough apart. Head downhill, I'll circle back toward the ridge. I shook my head, but he was already slipping away, almost melting into the shadows as the drone swept overhead again. I swallowed my panic and plunged into the thick brush, hoping the uneven terrain would break any line of sight. The forest felt suffocating, the shifting trails twisting beneath my feet in ways that seemed designed to disorient. My compass was useless, still spinning wildly, and the sun had vanished behind a thick layer of clouds, removing even that last sliver of certainty. I glanced at my watch. Noon, or something close to it. Time felt meaningless in this place. A sudden snap to my right made me freeze. My breath caught as a figure stepped out from behind a tree, one of the men from Camp 7. His eyes were cold, expression unreadable, but the gun in his hand told me everything I needed to know. Thought you could run? He said, voice low and steady. I backed up slowly, heart hammering. I'm not looking for trouble, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though my hands trembled. Trouble finds you, he said. He raised the rifle. I dove to the side, rolling behind a mossy rock as the shot rang out, the bullet thudding into the dirt where I just stood. The drone's buzz returned, louder now, as if guiding its operators to me. I scrambled to my feet, scanning for cover. My gaze landed on a narrow ravine a few yards away, a steep drop covered in loose rocks and twisted roots. Desperation pushed me toward it. I had no other choice. I sprinted, the man shouting behind me, his footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. I reached the edge and leapt, tumbling down the rocky slope, scraping my palms and knees. At the bottom, I gasped, pressing my back against the cold earth, trying to steady my breathing. The drone hovered above, its camera sweeping the ravine, the man's voice echoing faintly from somewhere overhead. I dared not move, the weight of fear pinning me in place. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The forest held its breath. Then, distant voices carried through the trees. Not the man's, but another female, sharp, commanding. Check the perimeter. He can't have gone far. I recognized the tone immediately. Marla, the leader of the Camp 7 hunters. Ruthless and strategic. The knowledge made my skin crawl. I edged forward, peering through the foliage. Two figures moved cautiously along the ravine's edge, scanning for any sign of me. I knew I had to get out of there, but the shifting trails and disappearing landmarks offered no safe route. I remembered Eli's words. They were hunting leaks. Anyone who knew more than they wanted was a target. I was no longer just lost, I was prey. I pulled out the notebook, flipping to the last pages. Scrawled notes, half smudged, hinted at a hidden cache somewhere near the old ranger station. Supplies, maybe a radio, or something that could help me call for help. If I could reach it, maybe I'd stand a chance. But first, I had to get past Marla and her team. I crept along the ravine, using every shadow and tree as cover. The forest seemed to warp around me, trails vanishing and reappearing like a cruel mirage. I paused when I heard a twig snap behind me. Spinning around, I found Eli crouched in the underbrush, eyes wide. "You made it," I whispered, relief flooding me. "Barely," he said. "They're tightening the noose. We don't have much time." He handed me a small, battered knife. "For close calls." I nodded, gripping it tightly. Suddenly, a voice called out from above, cold and precise. "Enough games. Come out, both of you." Marla stepped into view, flanked by 2 armed men. Her gaze was icy, unwavering. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." Eli and I exchanged a glance. The last shred of hope was collapsing. But then, from the shadows behind Marla, a third figure emerged, someone I never expected to see again. "Marla," the newcomer said, voice low but firm. "This ends now." The forest seemed to hold its breath once more. The shifting wilderness was closing in, and the real battle was about to begin. Marla's eyes flickered, a brief crack in her armor, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. "You? After all this time? What makes you think you have any say in this?" The newcomer stepped forward, revealing a scarred face hardened by years away but still carrying the unmistakable fire of conviction. "Because I've seen what this path leads to, and I won't let you drag us all down with you." Eli's hand tightened on his weapon, yet he didn't move. I felt a surge of something I hadn't acknowledged in a long time, hope. It was fragile, but it was there. Marla's men shifted uneasily, sensing the tension crackling between the 3 of them. The forest, dark and watchful, seemed to pulse with the rising stakes. No one spoke for a long moment, the silence heavy but charged. Finally, Marla's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're a fool if you think I'll back down." The newcomer's eyes never wavered. "Maybe. But some fools are the only thing standing between survival and destruction." The wind rattled the branches overhead, as if echoing that challenge. The battle wasn't just imminent, it was inevitable. The forest was quieter than I had ever heard it, the usual rustle of leaves and distant bird calls swallowed by a thick, unnatural silence. I sank to a fallen log, exhaustion pressing down like a weight on my shoulders. Eli leaned against a tree nearby, his breath ragged but steady, and Marla stood rigid, arms crossed, eyes sharp as ever but with a flicker of uncertainty behind them. Jonas approached slowly, the lines on his face deepening as he looked at each of us. "We don't have a lot of time. The wilderness out here isn't just shifting naturally. People are moving through it, controlling it, in a way. Changing the landscape to trap others, to keep them out, or worse." I swallowed hard. "You mean someone's doing this on purpose?" He nodded grimly. "Exactly. And Marla's been part of it." His gaze slid to her. "But it's not too late to stop." Marla's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about. You left this place years ago. You don't understand the stakes." Jonas's voice didn't waver. "I understand enough. This isn't survival. It's manipulation. And it's killing people." The weight of his words settled between us. I thought about the shifting rivers, the trails that had vanished or warped, the sun that no longer guided my compass. It was like the wilderness itself was a weapon, and people in Marla's group were wielding it. Eli finally spoke, voice low. "So what now? We can't stay here. They'll come back, stronger." Jonas pulled a crumpled map from his jacket. "There's a way out, a path that's still safe for now. But it's narrow, and it runs through their territory. We'll have to move fast and be smarter than they expect. I glanced at Marla. Her expression was unreadable, but her body relaxed marginally. You want us to trust you? She asked. Jonas gave a tight smile. I want us to survive. The three of us, me, Eli, and Jonas, stood, gathering what little gear we had left. Marla hesitated, then nodded. Fine. But if this is a trap... It's not, Jonas said. I'm done with the lies. The forest seemed to press in on us as we moved, the shadows longer and the air colder. Every snapped twig or rustling leaf felt like a signal. We kept close, silent except for whispered directions and the soft crunch of boots on leaf litter. The path Jonas described was narrow, winding along a ridge where the trees thinned enough to glimpse the shifting rivers below. I felt the old fear clawing at my chest, the feeling of being watched, hunted, but there was something else now, too, determination. We were moving toward freedom, but I knew it wouldn't come without cost. As we navigated a steep incline, a sudden shout shattered the silence. Stop them! Marla's men burst from the underbrush, weapons raised. The chase was on. Eli lunged forward, tackling one of the men to the ground. I ducked behind a tree, heart pounding, gripping the knife Jonas had given me. Marla was shouting orders, but her voice sounded desperate. I caught a glimpse of Jonas, already engaged in a brutal struggle with another assailant. The knife flashed, and a sharp cry followed. He stumbled back, blood dripping from a gash in his arm, but still standing. Adrenaline surged through me. I stepped out from cover, knife raised, and faced one of Marla's men charging at me. The man was bigger, stronger, but I had something he didn't, sheer will. I dodged his swing and drove the blade into his side. He collapsed with a grunt, eyes wide in shock. The fight blurred into a chaotic dance of survival. Eli and I backed Jonas up, and slowly the attackers faltered, retreating into the trees, leaving us panting and wounded but alive. We didn't waste time. Jonas led us down the ridge, away from the shifting maze of the forest's twisted geography. The sun, though still misaligned, felt less like a cruel joke and more like a distant promise. Hours later, we reached a clearing, one that matched the map from before the wilderness began to change. A gravel road lay beyond it, faint but unmistakable. Jonas pulled a battered radio from his pack, flipping it on. I'll call for help, he said, voice hoarse but steady. I sank to the ground, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The shifting trails, the manipulations, the violence, they were over, at least for now. Eli sat beside me, wiping blood from his forehead. You did good, he said quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I felt it yet. Marla watched from a distance, her expression softer than before. Maybe this is the end, she said, almost to herself. Jonas's radio crackled, a voice answering on the other end. Relief flooded me like a wave breaking over parched land. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought about the wilderness that had tried to swallow me whole, not with monsters or ghosts, but with people willing to reshape the world for their own ends. It was a darkness I hadn't expected, but one I now understood all too well. I stood slowly, looking at the road ahead. The way out was real, but so was the change inside me. I wasn't the same person who had started this hike, lost and confused. I was someone who had seen the worst of human nature and still found a way forward. The forest behind us whispered with secrets it would never tell. But I was ready to leave those shadows behind. For the first time in days, I felt the fragile stirrings of hope. It wasn't safe yet. It wouldn't ever be truly safe. But it was enough. It had to be. Because sometimes, surviving meant facing the darkness, not with fear, but with the courage to walk through it. And that was what I was going to do. Story 2, silent pursuer, footsteps in the forest. The morning air was sharp, the kind that wakes you up better than coffee ever could. I'd been hiking alone before. Plenty of times. I liked the solitude, the way the woods seemed to stretch out endlessly, indifferent to the smallness of human troubles. There was comfort in that, an escape from the daily noise of the city, the emails, the endless scrolling on my phone. I left my phone on airplane mode, tucked deep in my pocket, except for the occasional glance to check the time. It was early enough that no one would be around. That was the plan. The trail wound through dense pine and fir, their needles a deep green against the pale browns of last season's leaves. The ground was soft underfoot, a mix of damp earth and scattered twigs that crunched quietly with each step. The air smelled of pine resin and damp moss, that clean, earthy scent I always associated with being far from anything resembling civilization. I moved steadily, careful not to disturb the occasional patches of wildflowers or the small animals I glimpsed darting between the trees. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the steady rhythm of my footsteps on the trail. It was a sound I was used to, the soft thud of boots on dirt, the occasional scrape when I stepped over a root. But beneath it, something else began to catch my attention. Another set of footsteps, quiet, deliberate, matching mine. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath too. The other footsteps stopped, just as I did. My heart ticked up a notch, but I told myself it was probably just another hiker. Maybe someone who had gotten an earlier start than me. I called out softly, "Hello?" No answer. Just the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. I waited a moment longer, then started walking again. The footsteps resumed, same pace, same rhythm, just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but the trail was empty. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and still in the early light. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. "Get a grip," I muttered. Maybe a deer or some other animal was padding softly behind me. Or maybe, more likely, it was just my imagination. Still, the feeling of being watched settled heavy on my skin, like a thin film of sweat despite the cold. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was nothing. The trail climbed gently, winding around a small ridge with a better view of the valley below. I paused at the overlook, letting the breeze wash over me, and took a deep breath. The sun was just cresting the distant hills now, spilling gold over the treetops. For a moment, the world seemed perfect. Quiet. Safe. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow this time. Hesitant. Almost like they were testing me, waiting to see what I'd do. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, but the forest remained still. No sign of anyone. I stood frozen for a few heartbeats, the hairs on my neck prickling. The rational part of me told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, to trust in logic. I wasn't in a horror movie. There wasn't some unseen predator lurking just beyond the trees. Still, the primal part, the one that's wired to survive, whispered a warning I couldn't ignore. I started walking again, slower now, keeping my eyes on the path ahead but glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The footsteps followed, steady and quiet, never breaking pace, never speeding up or slowing down. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I tried calling out again, louder this time. "Hey! Is someone there?" Nothing but the wind. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I considered turning around and heading back the way I'd come, but the thought of retracing my steps with someone unseen matching me step for step made my skin crawl. I felt trapped between two choices, neither of them good. The trail narrowed as it dipped into a shallow ravine, the trees closing in tighter, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The light dimmed behind the canopy, and the forest sound shifted, the birdsong faded, replaced by the low rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. I stopped again. The footsteps halted, almost immediately. I held my breath and peered into the shadows. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught something, a flash of movement. Too quick to be a deer or a squirrel. Something human. The blood drained from my face. I backed up slowly, heart hammering, hands clenched into fists at my sides. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. They had been following me for miles, waiting, watching. I realized how foolish I'd been to think this was just a peaceful hike. This was no accident. And now, I was not alone. A low, almost inaudible rustle broke the silence again. I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing, every muscle tense like a coiled spring. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows, a tall silhouette, cloaked in dark clothing, face obscured. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the narrow trail behind me was blocked by dense underbrush. Trapped. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the cold, relentless stare of eyes that promised trouble. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a dark blot against the fading light. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, voice trembling more than I wanted. "If you're lost or need help, just say so." Still no answer. The figure shifted slightly, the rustle of fabric the only sound breaking the heavy silence. My mind raced. Why follow me so silently? Why wait until now to reveal themselves? And most importantly, what did they want? I took a slow, cautious step backward, keeping my eyes locked on the figure's shadowed face. The forest seemed to close in around me, the canopy blotting out the last of the light, turning the world into a dim, hostile place. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and uneven, and the distant call of that crow again. Suddenly, the figure moved just a step, barely noticeable, but enough to send a fresh wave of panic through me. I spun around and bolted down the trail, branches whipping in my arms and face. I didn't look back, not even once, not until I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up and the fading daylight spilled down in pale shafts. I stopped, gasping, heart pounding like a drum. The footsteps behind me had stopped as well, no chase, no pursuit. Just silence. The clearing was quiet, too quiet. I scanned the edges, looking for any sign of the figure, but the shadows held nothing but trees. I pulled out my phone, hand shaking, and tried to call for help. No signal. Of course. This place was miles from the nearest road, and the thick canopy killed the signal as surely as the isolation did. I forced myself to breathe deeply, trying to push down the rising tide of fear. I had to think. Panic wouldn't help me now. I looked around the clearing again and noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small pile of stones near a tree trunk, arranged carefully, deliberately. Someone had been here, marking something. A trail marker? A warning? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I crouched to examine the stones, and that's when I saw it, a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch, torn and stained dark. I peeled it off carefully. The color was a deep green, but it was the smell that hit me hardest, something metallic, like rusted iron mixed with something sweeter, almost like blood. My stomach twisted. Whoever had been following me wasn't just some lost hiker. They had been here, close enough to leave traces, close enough to watch. I stuffed the fabric into my backpack and stood up, scanning the forest again. The shadows were growing longer now, the last light slipping away. I needed to get out. I needed to find help. But the trail behind me was still blocked by thick brush. I couldn't go back the way I came. I forced myself to move forward, deeper into the clearing, hoping for another path. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and broken branches that snapped underfoot. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, the distant call of the crow, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint crunch of footsteps just beyond my vision. I stopped dead. There it was again. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, following me still. I spun around, eyes wide, heart hammering in my chest. But the clearing was empty. No sign of the figure, no movement. I took a few shaky breaths and reminded myself that I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out here, stalking me, playing cat and mouse. The thought was suffocating. I pulled out my map, tracing my finger along the marked trails. There was a ranger station about 5 miles north, across a ridge and through a denser part of the forest. It was a long way, but it was my only chance. I stuffed the map back into my pack and started moving, slow and steady, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The footsteps continued behind me, always matching my pace, never breaking the rhythm. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a narrow deer trail, barely visible beneath the leaves. It veered away from the main path, winding through thicker underbrush. I hesitated, then decided to take it, hoping to throw off whoever was following me. The trail led me downhill, the air growing cooler and damper. The trees grew taller here, their trunks thick with moss, their branches tangled overhead. The light dimmed further, and the oppressive silence returned. Then I heard it again, a low, guttural sound, like a growl or a whispered curse. I froze. The sound came from just ahead, somewhere in the shadows. I strained my eyes but saw nothing. "Hello?" I called out, voice cracking. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just the weight of the forest pressing in around me. I took a step forward, then another, heart racing. My hand brushed against something on the ground. I looked down and saw a small notebook, its cover worn and smeared with dirt. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. The writing was messy, hurried notes, sketches, maps of the forest. But some pages were different. They were filled with names, dates, and disturbing descriptions. Detailed accounts of people who had passed through the area, observations about their habits, their weaknesses. My stomach turned. I was reading the journal of my stalker. A sudden noise behind me, a twig snapping, made me spin around. The figure was there again, just at the edge of the clearing, watching. Closer this time. I backed away slowly, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. The footsteps followed, relentless and silent. I was running out of options, and the forest was closing in. As the last light disappeared, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a hike. It was a hunt. And I was the prey. I spent the night curled beneath the thick canopy, the journal pressed against my chest like a shield. When dawn broke, pale and uncertain, I slipped the journal into the side pocket of my pack and pushed myself to my feet. The forest seemed different in daylight, less sinister, but no less isolating. The silence was oppressive, like the breath of something waiting just out of sight. I kept close to the deer trail, the one I'd taken the night before, its narrow dirt ribbon winding downhill beneath thick trees, moss hanging from branches like tattered curtains. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning the shadows. The footsteps had stopped overnight, but I knew better than to think I was safe. Whoever was following me had patience, and patience meant danger that could last for hours, maybe days. I didn't want to think about what they might be waiting for. After an hour, I reached a small clearing where the sun broke through in shards, painting the ground in gold. I paused there, pulling out the journal and flipping through the pages again. The handwriting was frantic, the sketches crude but chillingly precise. Names with dates. Descriptions of hikers, how they moved, where they stopped, what they carried. And then, more disturbing still, notes on their habits, stops at creek to drink, avoids thick brush, favors main trail. I traced a finger down a page and stopped at a passage I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a description of a hiker. It was a plan. A date marked 2 weeks ago, with a sketch of the clearing I was standing in now. The note read, "Best spot to wait. Good vantage on trail. Can trap if needed." My heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't random. This was methodical. The stalker had been here before, had studied this path, this forest, this clearing. And now, I was walking right into their trap. I stuffed the journal back into my pack and looked around, desperate to find something, anything that could help me. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a tangle of vines, was a crude snare, a loop of thin wire tied to a bent sapling, its trigger mechanism barely concealed beneath leaves. I swallowed hard. The snare was designed to catch something by the ankle. It wasn't deadly, but the pain and panic it would cause could slow me down enough to give this person the advantage. They weren't just stalking me. They were hunting me. I backed away carefully, stepping around the trap and marking its location in my mind. But the realization that I was being hunted in a place I'd come to trust twisted my stomach into knots. This forest, which I had imagined as a sanctuary from the chaos of the world, was a cage. My thoughts tumbled over themselves. What did this person want? Why me? I had been cautious, sticking to marked trails, carrying only a day pack with essentials. Nothing valuable. No flashy gear or expensive camera equipment. I wasn't a threat or a prize. Just a solo hiker trying to escape city life for a while. Then came the cold, sharp truth. Sometimes, there is no reason. Sometimes, you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I retraced my steps slowly, keeping my eyes peeled for other traps or signs. And that's when I found the second one, a pitfall, cleverly disguised with a thin layer of leaves and twigs. I stumbled over it, barely catching myself, and my breath hitched. If I had fallen in, I might have broken bones, or worse. The stalker was prepared. They had set multiple traps along the trail, turning this forest into a gauntlet. It was a warning and a message: don't try to escape. Panic flared, but I forced it down. I had to be smarter. I had to outthink this person. I moved on, slower now, eyes darting and ears straining. The forest seemed to close tighter around me, each shadow a potential hiding place. The journal felt heavier in my pack, a burden of knowledge I wished I didn't have. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, but my nerves only frayed further. The footsteps had been silent last night, but now I heard something else, soft breathing, almost imperceptible, carried by the breeze. It wasn't far. I was close. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. The breathing matched my own pace, steady and controlled. I held my breath and glanced behind a thick oak. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Then the voice came. Low. Gravelly. Just a whisper, but unmistakable. You're not supposed to be here. I spun around, backpack slamming into my shoulders, eyes wide. The brush rustled, and a man stepped into the clearing. Mid-30s, unshaven, clothes torn and dirty but purposeful. His eyes were cold, calculating, and his smile didn't reach them. Why are you following me? I demanded, voice trembling but firm. He shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I liked the quiet. I liked the hunt. The air thickened with tension. I knew I had to act fast. There was no negotiating with someone like this. No reasoning. Only survival. I took a step back, reaching for the small pocket knife in my jacket. The man's smile widened, and he snapped his fingers. "Don't bother," he said. "You're already mine." Then, almost casually, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph, the same photograph I had seen in the journal, of a group of hikers. And there, in the background, was me. My breath caught. He had been watching me for weeks, maybe longer. This wasn't a random encounter. It was planned. I glanced down at the journal in my pack and realized something even more terrifying. This man knew everything about me. Every step I'd taken, every move I'd made in this forest. He was always one step ahead. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't lost. I wasn't alone. I was being hunted, and the forest was his domain. And now, there was no turning back. The forest had never felt so claustrophobic. He took a step closer, the photograph still crumpled in his hand. "You didn't think it was coincidence, did you? Me showing up out of nowhere?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, but the smile never left his eyes. "I've been tracking you since you set foot here. I know your routines, your breaks, even your worst fears. This forest is mine, and you..." He paused and leaned in just enough for me to catch the faint scent of sweat and earth. "You're just another game." I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic that clawed at my throat. "Why?" I managed, voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" His brow furrowed, as if considering the question seriously. "Why anyone?" "Because you're out here alone. Because you think you can disappear into the wilderness and nobody will notice. You're wrong." He gestured broadly to the dense woods around us. "Nobody gets lost. Not really. Not when I'm around." I glanced down at my pack, the journal pressing heavily against my back. It was a grim reminder of the trail I'd left behind, every step, every note, every secret. He knew it all. And more terrifyingly, he'd been waiting for the perfect moment to close in. The man's smile twisted. "You don't have to be afraid. Not yet. I'm not going to hurt you, immediately." His voice dropped, a dark promise threading through the words. "But you're going to come with me. We're going for a little walk." I shook my head, backing up until my heels hit a gnarled root. "No." He shrugged again, as if my refusal was a minor inconvenience. "Then I'll have to make you." Fear surged through me, sharp and clear. I had to act, but the forest offered no easy escape. My eyes darted around, searching for anything, any path, any tool, any advantage. The man stepped forward again, deliberate and slow, like a predator savoring the chase. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. My heart leapt. I spun around, knife raised, but there was only the dense undergrowth, swaying gently in the breeze. Or was it breeze? The hairs on my neck stood up. Another sound, footsteps. Not mine, not his, but closer, faster. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice cracking with desperation. The man's head tilted, eyes narrowing. "You have friends? Don't bother. No one's coming." But the footsteps were different now, urgent, uneven, panicked. Then a voice, hoarse and ragged, called out from the shadows. "Help. Please. Someone." I blinked, trying to place the voice. It was faint but unmistakable, a woman. I hadn't heard another human all day, but now the forest seemed to shift around us, the tension snapping taut. The man cursed under his breath, his calm slipping. "Stay here," he ordered me. "Don't move." But I was already moving, breaking toward the direction of the cry. The man lunged, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. Pain seared through my wrist, but I twisted free, adrenaline drowning out the sting. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted as I sprinted toward the voice. "Who is she?" The man's footsteps thundered behind me, relentless. I burst through a thicket and found her, bruised, dirty, crouched beneath a fallen tree. Her eyes were wide with terror. "You have to get out," she gasped. He's been following me for days. He killed my boyfriend. Please, just leave." My breath caught. The reality of the situation crashed over me in waves. I wasn't alone in this nightmare. The man had been hunting more than just me. And now, somehow, we were both trapped. Behind me, the stalker appeared, his expression dark and furious. "No one leaves. Not alive." I grabbed the woman's hand, pulling her up. The forest was no longer just a place of quiet beauty. It was a cage, a trap closing in, and the hunter was ready to strike. We ran, breath ragged, hearts pounding, deeper into the shadows of the trees. But the footsteps behind us didn't falter. They matched our pace, unstoppable and cold. And I realized, with a sinking certainty, that this was far from over. Branches whipped against my face as we pushed forward, the underbrush snagging at our clothes like desperate fingers. The woman's grip tightened around mine, her nails digging in, a silent plea not to let go. The forest seemed alive now, every rustle a threat, every shadow a potential assailant. "Over there," she gasped, pointing toward a narrow creek winding like a silver thread through the gloom. Without hesitation, I veered toward it, hoping the water might mask our scent or slow the man behind us. The ground beneath was slick with moss and fallen leaves, making each step a gamble. We reached the bank and plunged into the cold current, water lapping at our knees and chilling us to the bone. The stalker paused at the edge, snarling in frustration, but didn't follow. I dared to glance back. His silhouette remained fixed at the tree line, unmoving yet menacing. For a heartbeat, relief surged through me. Maybe we had shaken him off. But then a snap echoed from the far bank. A twig breaking under weight. The chase was not over. It was merely evolving, shifting with the forest's ancient rhythm. And somewhere out there, the hunter waited, patient and ruthless, ready to close the distance once more. The dawn came slow and gray, the kind that seeps through the trees without promise. "We need to move," I whispered, voice hoarse from the cold and fear. She nodded, but her strength was fragile, like a candle flickering in a draft. We had spent the night crouched beneath a fallen tree, listening to the forest's quiet, pretending the shadows wouldn't creep closer at dawn. The stalker hadn't come near, but his presence lingered like a stain. I forced my legs to obey, pushing us forward on trembling limbs. The creek that had given us momentary refuge was behind us now, replaced by a landscape slick with frost and fallen leaves. Every step was tentative, every sound amplified, an owl's distant call, the snap of a twig, the crunch of leaves underfoot. "I think he's waiting," the woman said quietly, at the edge of the trees. "He's watching us." I swallowed hard. It was true. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to our terror, it was the stalker's domain. He knew every path, every hiding place. And we were intruders, desperate and exposed. As we moved, I traced the woman's face, bruised, pale, but alive. She wasn't just a fellow victim. She was a reminder of why I couldn't give up, why I had to be more than prey. Hours passed like that, silent, cautious, each breath a small victory. Then we reached a dirt road, the kind that rarely saw traffic but still marked the edge of the wild. Relief surged, but it was tempered by exhaustion and suspicion. The stalker could still be out there, waiting for us to make a wrong move. "Stay close," I said. "We signal someone. Anyone." She nodded, and I pulled out the phone from my jacket. The screen cracked, battery nearly dead, but it was something. I managed a weak signal and called 911, barely able to form the words between shivers and sobs. The operator's calm voice was an anchor. Help was on its way. I told them where we were, what had happened. The woman added details, her voice steadier now, anchored by the knowledge that rescue was coming. Then we waited. The stalker never appeared on the road, never broke the line between forest and human world. It was as though he understood the boundary, or perhaps he knew he'd lost his advantage. Either way, the nightmare that had chased us for miles was finally losing ground. When the flashing lights appeared through the trees, I felt the first tears slip free, not just from relief but from the weight of everything that had happened. The police moved quickly, escorting us to safety, their presence a shield against the dark. Later, in the sterile brightness of the hospital, the woman and I sat side by side, still trembling but alive. We didn't speak much, words felt inadequate, but our shared silence was a tenuous bond, a fragile thread woven from fear, survival, and something like hope. The police confirmed they found the man's camp deeper in the woods, a makeshift shelter with weapons and evidence of others he had stalked. The news was grim, but it meant the nightmare was over. Over the following days, I grappled with the aftermath. The forest, once a sanctuary for solitude, now felt like a scar etched into my memory. But in that scar, I found something unexpected, a fierce clarity. I realized how fragile safety was, how quickly normal life could fracture. But I also saw how deeply resilience could root itself in the most broken places. I didn't return to hiking for a long time, but when I did, it was different. I walked with eyes wide open, heart alert but not paralyzed. The forest was still beautiful, still wild, but I had learned its shadows and my own strength. The woman and I stayed in touch, bound by an unspoken understanding. We were survivors, not victims. The terror had changed us, but it hadn't defined us. And as the seasons turned, the memory of footsteps behind me, matching my pace, became a reminder not of fear, but of survival, and the quiet courage it takes to keep moving forward. The forest around me shifted with the passing days, lush greens deepening into autumnal golds, the air growing crisper, carrying the scent of earth and pine. Each morning, I returned to the trail with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear that once gripped me had softened into vigilance, a steady awareness that no longer consumed but guided me. I learned to read the whispers of the wind and the rustle of leaves, not as threats, but as signs, a language the forest spoke to those patient enough to listen. Sometimes, I would pause by a moss-covered stone or a quiet stream, letting the stillness wash over me. In those moments, the past's shadows felt less like chains and more like echoes, reminders of battles fought and lessons earned. The woman's voice would sometimes come to me, steady and calm, her words a balm. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward in spite of it. Our connection, though silent across the miles, was a tether to resilience. We shared stories of small victories, the first night's peaceful sleep, the courage to face another dawn, the gentle reclaiming of life beyond pain. I carried those stories like talismans, proof that survival was an act of daily bravery. As the light waned with each setting sun, I realized that the forest had become more than just a backdrop to my journey. It was a testament to growth and renewal, a living metaphor for the cycles of healing I was undergoing. The footsteps that once haunted me now symbolized the resilience that had taken root within. They were no longer a signal of pursuit but a rhythm of endurance, a steady beat marking the path forward, illuminated by the quiet courage I had found deep inside. Story 3, Silent Ward, Haunting Footsteps in Abandoned Asylum. I had been chasing ruins for years, drawn to the silent remnants of places where time seemed to have stopped. I arrived just as the morning sun began to break through a thin mist, the air still cool and sharp with early spring. The building loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against a pale sky. The main entrance, a pair of heavy wooden doors warped and peeling, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. I hesitated only briefly before pushing through, the hinges groaning softly, swallowed quickly by the thick hush that filled the vast, empty halls. Inside, the light was dim and uneven, filtering through grimy windows stained with years of weather and neglect. The air smelled of damp plaster and rust, a scent that clung to the back of my throat. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. The floors creaked underfoot, a low groan that echoed through the cavernous space. It was easy to imagine the thousands of footsteps that must have once filled these corridors. Patients shuffled along, doctors hurried between wards, lives lived out in the sterile routine of this place. I lifted my camera, framing a shot of a long hallway lined with peeling paint and faded signs. Ward B, one read, the letters almost worn away. The windows beyond were cracked, casting fractured light across the floor. I snapped a photo, the shutters clicked startling in the quiet. As I moved deeper, I noticed the walls adorned with remnants of a past life, yellowed posters warning against tuberculosis, faded portraits of stern-faced staff, and a scattering of old patient records pinned beneath cracked glass. The names and dates blurred together, echoing a history I could only guess at. I made notes in my journal, careful to capture the details, the layout, the decay, the way the shadows pulled in corners where the light never reached. After an hour, I reached the central wing, a long, narrow corridor flanked by locked doors. Each had a small, barred window at eye level, but the glass was mostly broken or missing. I pressed my ear to one of the doors, half expecting what? A voice? A sound? Nothing but silence. Still, the feeling that I was not entirely alone crept over me, a prickling at the back of my neck. I chalked it up to the building itself, the way old places can play tricks on your mind. The wind outside had risen, rattling the broken panes in their frames, and somewhere deep in the bowels of the asylum, a pipe groaned and hissed like an old man's breath. I told myself it was nothing more than that. I was about to move on when I heard it, a faint shuffle, barely audible over the ambient noises of settling wood and shifting metal. A quick, soft step, like someone dragging a shoe against the floor. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, barely a whisper, but definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere down the hall behind me. I turned sharply, heart pounding, but the corridor was empty. The shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the far end of the passage. I called out, my voice sounding small and brittle in the vast space. "Hello?" No answer. I debated leaving then and there, but curiosity edged out caution. I checked the door I had just pressed my ear to and tried the handle again. Locked, as before. The footsteps hadn't moved closer, yet I could still feel their presence, a weight pressing just beyond sight. I stepped back, scanning the area. The light was fading now, the sun slipping lower behind the trees surrounding the asylum. As I turned to leave the corridor, I noticed something on the floor, a small, scuffed footprint in the dust, fresh enough to be recent. It was too large to be mine, and too defined to have been there long. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I told myself it must be someone else, an urban explorer like me, or maybe a vagrant seeking shelter. But the asylum had been sealed off for years, and no one was supposed to be inside. The thought made my skin prickle. I checked my phone for signal, nothing. No way to call for help if I needed it. The footsteps had stopped, but now I was certain of one thing. I was not alone in the asylum. I gathered my gear quickly, deciding to head back toward the entrance. As I moved down the hall, the weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back, tracking every step. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath me. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, another sound, this time unmistakable, a slow, deliberate footstep echoing behind me, just out of sight. I didn't look back. Not yet. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps continued, steady and unwavering, matching my pace almost perfectly. I forced myself to keep moving forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The dim light flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the peeling walls. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder, sharper, as if the very atmosphere was thickening with malevolence. Ahead, a door stood slightly ajar, its hinges groaning softly in the silence. Instinctively, I edged toward it, slipping inside before the footsteps could close the distance. The room was small and cluttered, filled with rusted medical equipment and stained mattresses. I pressed myself against the far wall, heart pounding so loudly I feared it would give away my position. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A shadow appeared in the gap, tall and indistinct. Then, slowly, the door creaked open wider, revealing nothing but empty hallway bathed in pale moonlight. I exhaled shakily, unsure if I was safe or simply caught in a cruel game of cat and mouse. I waited until the footsteps faded entirely before I dared to move again. The moonlight spilling through the cracked windows gave me just enough to navigate. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness with a weak, wavering glow. I swept it down the corridor, eyes straining to catch the faintest hint of movement or shadow. Nothing. Just peeling paint, broken glass, and the debris of decades left to rot. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The rational part of me wanted to call this a fluke, maybe a homeless person had snuck in, or a wildlife noise echoed oddly in the hollow halls. But the footsteps had been too deliberate, too human. I pressed onward, forcing my feet to carry me deeper into the asylum's heart. The further I went, the more the stench of mold and decay gnawed at my throat, a thick, sour smell that clung to everything. The floor beneath me groaned softly, boards warped and weakened by time and neglect. I tried to ignore the way my skin prickled, the sensation that invisible eyes were tracking me. About 20 yards down the hall, I spotted something odd, a faint smear on the wall, dark and sticky. I crouched to inspect it closer. It looked like dried blood, crusted and flaked with age, but still unmistakably human. My mind raced. Was this from a patient? A fight? Or something worse? I shone my light further along the hallway. On the floor lay scattered scraps of torn fabric, and beyond that, a pair of old, battered shoes, half buried under a pile of debris. Something about their position suggested someone had left in a hurry, or had been dragged away. My pulse quickened. Whoever had been here wasn't just hiding. They'd been trapped, confined, or desperate to escape. I slipped my phone from my pocket, hoping for a signal, anything. Still nothing. No bars, no messages, just the same dead screen. I cursed under my breath. Without communication, I was truly alone in this crumbling maze. I adjusted my pack and moved on, my light flickering over peeling posters and faded signage. Patient names, dates, warnings, reminders of the lives that had passed through these halls. Names like Grayson, Mills, Carr, old photographs showed pale faces staring blankly from the past. It was easy to lose yourself in the history here, to forget the present dangers. But the footsteps haunted me. I rounded a corner and stopped short. At the end of the hall was a door, half open, swaying slightly. A faint sound emerged, a soft scrape, like nails dragging against wood. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard and moved closer. Inside the room, a toppled chair lay against the wall, its legs splintered and broken. The floor was marked with scuffings, as if someone had paced endlessly. Near the window, a torn scrap of cloth fluttered in the cold draft. Then I heard it, a low, desperate whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. I froze. "Hello?" I called, voice cracking. No answer. Only silence and that restless draft. I felt my skin crawl. Whoever or whatever was here was scared. or dangerous. I stepped back into the hall and scanned my surroundings. Something glinted beneath a pile of rubble near the doorframe. I crouched and pulled out a small object, an old metal key, tarnished but intact. Keys didn't just lie around by accident. Someone had left this here deliberately, or maybe dropped it in panic. My mind jumped to the sealed-off wings of the asylum. Could this unlock one of those forgotten doors? Could it lead me to whoever was trapped inside? I slipped the key into my pocket and moved on, heart hammering. Every step echoed louder now, each creak and groan amplified in the silence. The building seemed alive, watching, waiting. As I turned another corner, my flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled for the spare batteries in my pack, hands trembling. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Just as I replaced the batteries, a soft, deliberate thud sounded ahead, footsteps again, unmistakably close. I froze, every instinct screaming to run. But where to? The hallway stretched both ways, a black void on either side. Then, from the shadows, a voice, low, urgent, barely a whisper, cut through the dark. "Don't come any closer." My breath caught. The voice was hoarse, desperate, human. I swallowed my fear. "Who's there? Are you okay?" Silence. Then another thud, and a shadow darted away down the hall. I chased after it, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The footsteps were quick now, retreating, but they weren't fast enough to escape my gaze. I reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy metal door stood locked shut. The shadow had vanished. I pressed my ear to the cold metal. From the other side came faint, ragged breathing. Someone was trapped in here. And they were alive. I pulled out the key. My hand shook as I fitted it into the lock. The tumblers clicked. The door creaked open a few inches, then slammed shut with a violent bang. I spun around, heart in my throat, and caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure stood just beyond the doorway, just out of the light. Their eyes glinted in the dark. And they smiled. A shiver ran down my spine as the smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. The night outside had settled into a thick, suffocating silence, but inside the asylum, the air felt charged, as if the walls themselves held their breath. I forced myself to breathe evenly, slow and steady. There was no time for panic. Whoever or whatever stood there was watching me, waiting. I couldn't just leave. Too much was at stake. Someone was trapped inside this building. Someone still alive. And now, I was tangled in a story far bigger and darker than I'd imagined. I glanced down at the key in my palm, cold from the metal, cold like the building around me. That key had been the first breadcrumb. Now it felt like the gatekeeper to everything I didn't want to find. But I had to know. I pulled my flashlight back out, clicking it on. The beam wavered but held steady this time. I edged forward, voice low but steady. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Just that smile, slowly fading as their eyes fixed on me, sharp and calculating. Then, without warning, they stepped forward. The light caught their face in full, a man, gaunt, eyes sunken but burning with something fierce and wild. His clothes hung off him in tatters, stained and torn. He looked like he hadn't seen daylight in years, but there was a spark in him, something unbroken. "I'm not your enemy," I said quickly. "I want to help." He scoffed, a harsh, dry sound. "Help? No one comes here to help." I swallowed hard, realizing how right he was. No one had come here for decades. No one who mattered. "What's your name?" I asked. He hesitated, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Simon. Simon, I repeated. How did you get trapped here? He looked away down the hall, eyes narrowing. Not trapped. Hiding. From them. From who? His gaze snapped back to me. The Watchers. They never left. They just changed faces. I shivered. The idea of being watched in a place like this wasn't new, but Simon's tone made it real. Immediate. Terrifying. Tell me everything, I said. I'm listening. Simon's shoulders sagged as if the weight of years pressed down on him. He leaned against the wall, eyes distant. This place wasn't just an asylum. It was a prison. Not just for the patients, but for secrets. People who knew too much. People who saw too much. They locked us away, said we were mad, but it was lies. The real madness was outside these walls. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The crumbling halls, the decaying rooms, they weren't just abandoned. They were erased, hidden from the world for a reason. Who locked you in? I pressed. He laughed bitterly. Not who. What? A system. A network. They didn't want us telling stories. They used this place to disappear people. People who threatened the truth. I looked at Simon, trying to reconcile the man before me with the asylum's grim history I'd read about in dusty archives. Was this all just conspiracy? Or was I standing on the edge of something much darker? Why are you still here? I asked. Because leaving means death. They watch every exit. They track every step. I've learned to move in shadows. To be silence itself. A sudden noise made me jump, metal scraping against concrete from somewhere down the hall. Simon tensed, eyes flicking to the darkness. They're close, he said. I have to move. Wait, I said, heart pounding. We can get out together. You don't have to stay here. Simon shook his head slowly. You don't understand. They're not just guards or police. They're worse. They're ghosts of this place, people who never left, who protect the lies. Then let me help you expose it, I said, voice firm. I have a camera. I'm documenting everything. If we get proof, no one can ignore what happened here. For a long moment, he just stared at me, that wild look softening. Then he nodded once, sharply. Okay. But you have to trust me. I did. Because despite the fear gnawing at my gut, I knew that walking away now wasn't an option. Not when the truth was this close. We moved together, careful and slow, Simon leading me through corridors I never thought I'd see. Every shadow felt alive. Every step echoed with the weight of unseen eyes. Then, in a forgotten room cloaked in darkness, Simon stopped. He pulled back a broken panel on the wall, revealing a narrow passageway. This is how I've survived, he said. They don't know I'm here. I shined my light down the tunnel. It disappeared into pitch black. The air smelled stale and cold, but it was a way out or deeper in. I didn't know which. Simon looked over his shoulder, eyes sharp. Once we go in, there's no turning back. Are you ready? I nodded, heart thundering. The key was in my pocket, the camera in my hand, and now a man named Simon was depending on me. The passageway swallowed us whole, and the asylum's secrets waited in the dark. The silence pressed down, broken only by the scrape of our boots on cracked stone. Shadows shifted unnervingly along the walls, and I could feel something watching us, something ancient. Simon's grip tightened on his flashlight. Stay close, he whispered. Ahead, faint whispers echoed, barely audible but unmistakable. The deeper we went, the thicker the air grew, as if the asylum itself was holding its breath. The tunnel swallowed us whole, the weak beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness. "Do you hear that?" Simon's voice was a low whisper, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. I paused, straining to catch any sound beyond our footsteps. At first, there was nothing but the scraping of stone beneath our boots and the faint drip of water somewhere ahead. Then, a soft shuffle, a muted, uneven rhythm that didn't match our pace. Footsteps. Someone else was here. "We're not alone," I said, swallowing the sudden surge of panic. Simon didn't reply immediately. His grip on his flashlight tightened, knuckles pale in the dim light. "They're watching," he said finally. "Waiting for the right moment." The thought sent a cold spike down my spine. Who were they? Guards? Squatters? Or something worse? The asylum's history was riddled with stories of violence, abuse, and disappearances. None of it made sense until now, but now the pieces began to fit in a terrifying pattern. We pressed on, the tunnel twisting and narrowing. The walls closed in, slick with moisture, and the air grew so thick it was hard to breathe. I fumbled with my camera, hoping to capture whatever evidence I could find, but the screen fogged over almost instantly. Suddenly, a faint light flickered ahead, a weak, pulsing glow that seemed almost artificial. Simon stopped, signaling me to do the same. We crouched behind a jagged outcrop of stone, watching as a figure emerged from a side passage. The man was thin, his clothes tattered and stained, eyes white with something between fear and fury. He moved with a desperate energy, scanning the darkness like a predator sensing prey. When he spotted us, his expression twisted into a grimace. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice hoarse but sharp. Simon stepped forward, hands raised slightly. "Easy. We're not here to hurt you." The man's gaze flicked between us, searching for signs of deceit. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "They don't like it when people come looking." "Who are they?" I asked, voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. He hesitated, then spoke in a low, bitter tone. "The ones who run this place now. The ones who keep the truth buried." A chill settled over me. This wasn't just a deranged squatter or a lost soul. This was someone caught in the asylum's dark web, someone trapped and terrified. Simon nodded slowly. "We want to help. We want to expose what's really happening here." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're getting into. The asylum doesn't just trap bodies, it traps minds. And once you're in, it's impossible to leave." A sudden noise shattered the tense moment, a metallic clang echoing from deeper in the tunnel. The man's head snapped toward the sound, his face paling. "They're coming," he hissed. "You have to move. Now!" Without waiting for a response, he bolted down the passage, vanishing into the darkness. Simon and I exchanged a glance, unspoken agreement passing between us. We had no choice but to follow. We ran. The tunnel twisted wildly, narrowing until we had to squeeze sideways through tight gaps. The sound behind us grew louder, heavy boots pounding, voices shouting orders I couldn't understand, but the urgency was clear. "Faster," Simon urged, pulling me along. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed harder. The wall seemed to close in, the air thick with dust and decay. Then, just as I felt my strength failing, we burst into a cavernous chamber. The space was vast and desolate, lit only by shards of moonlight filtering through shattered windows high above. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the floor was slick with an unidentifiable dark stain. In the center stood a rusted elevator shaft, its doors hanging open like a gaping wound. "Down here," Simon said, voice urgent. It's our only chance. I hesitated, glancing back toward the tunnel. The sounds were closer now, shouts, the scrape of metal against stone, the unmistakable crackle of radios. "Come on," Simon urged, gripping my arm. Together, we descended into the shaft, the elevator car long gone, leaving only a dizzying drop below. The metal ladder was rusted and unstable, but Simon moved with certainty, his hands steady as he descended. I followed, heart in my throat, every rung a test of will. Halfway down, the shouting reached a fever pitch. Flashlights flashed like distant stars through the murky gloom. I could see figures moving above us, dozens of them, searching, hunting. "Keep quiet," Simon whispered fiercely. "If they find us here, it's over." I nodded, swallowing hard. My fingers trembled as I gripped the ladder, the cold metal biting through my gloves. Suddenly, a voice called out from above, a harsh, commanding tone that froze me in place. "Stop. We know you're down there." Simon's eyes locked with mine, a flash of desperation. "We have to keep going." But then, from the shadows below, a new sound, a soft, deliberate tapping, like footsteps moving against the concrete floor. Not from above, but below. Something else was down here with us. I swallowed the rising panic, shining my flashlight downward. The beam landed on a figure emerging from the darkness, another man, younger, thinner, eyes wild with fear and something else I couldn't name. He moved slowly, hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. "Wait," the newcomer said, voice shaking. "You don't understand. They're not just after you. They're after all of us." Simon's grip tightened on the ladder. "Who's they?" The man's eyes flicked nervously over his shoulder. "The ones who run this place. The ones who keep us prisoners. We have to stick together if we want to survive." Before I could respond, the floor above us shuddered with heavy footsteps. The hunters were closing in. "Go," the newcomer urged. "I'll hold them off." "No," Simon said firmly. "We stick together." The man shook his head, panic flashing. "You don't know what's coming." A sudden crash echoed from above, the sound of a door being forced open. I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my chest. Time was running out. Simon glanced at me, eyes hard. "We have to move. Now." The three of us scrambled down the ladder, deeper into the asylum's forgotten bowels. The darkness closed in, suffocating, relentless. And somewhere behind us, the desperate footsteps multiplied. They were coming. And this time, there would be no turning back. The air was heavy, thick with the stale breath of the asylum's forgotten corridors. We were alive. Somehow, that was a small victory. The night had been a blur of frantic movement, whispered plans, and narrow escapes. After Eli had stayed behind, turning to face the hunters with a courage I hadn't expected, we vanished deeper into the maze of tunnels and rooms beneath the asylum. The footsteps that had once echoed behind us grew fainter, but I never dared to believe they were gone for good. Somewhere in the darkness, those men still waited, still hunted. Simon had collapsed a few hours ago, his body racked with shivers and exhaustion. I could see the edges of his resolve fraying, but not completely breaking. Eli's sacrifice had changed something in him. It had changed me too. I closed my eyes and let myself remember, not the terror, but the moments that came after, the desperate alliance, the whispered truths that Eli shared in fleeting breaths. "They're doctors, orderlies, people who worked here," he said, voice low and urgent. "When the asylum closed, they didn't want to lose their control. They turned this place into a prison for patients who never left, for anyone who stumbled in, and anyone who tries to leave. It was a twisted legacy of cruelty, hidden beneath layers of rust and decay. No ghosts, No spirits, just men and women who had made this hell and refused to let it go. Now, as the pale light edged in, I realized the full weight of what we uncovered. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was a cage, and we'd been the unwitting prey. Simon stirred beside me, groaning softly. His eyes fluttered open, hazy but clear enough to meet mine. "We can't stay here," he said, voice rough. "We have to find a way out before they regroup." I nodded, feeling the dull ache of my own wounds and the heavy pull of fear, but also something else, resolve. Whatever this place was, whatever horrors it held, I wasn't going to let it swallow me up. We moved slowly through the tunnels, guided by memory and the faint outlines of peeling paint and rusted pipes. We avoided the main corridors, choosing instead narrow service shafts and forgotten maintenance rooms. The building groaned around us, the weight of years pressing down like a living thing. At one point, we stumbled upon a door marked "Emergency Exit." It was rusted shut, but Simon managed to pry it open with a crowbar I hadn't noticed he'd taken from the ladder earlier. The fresh air rushed in, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of rain and earth. For a moment, I thought we might be free. But then came the echo, a heavy footstep, deliberate and slow, from the other side of the exit. Simon froze, crowbar raised. I held my breath. A figure stepped into the dim light, silhouetted and still. It was a man, older, dressed in a worn lab coat stained with something dark. His eyes were cold, calculating, but not without a flicker of something else, recognition, perhaps, or regret. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "This place, it's not meant for outsiders." "We're leaving," Simon said, stepping forward. "No one else has to get hurt." The man hesitated, then pulled back, closing the door behind him. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Minutes passed like hours. Then, without warning, we heard another sound, metal scraping against concrete from a side passage nearby. Simon grabbed my arm. "Come on." We slipped away, deeper into the bowels of the asylum once more. The exit was no longer an option. But then, unexpectedly, we found Eli waiting for us in the darkness. He was bruised and bleeding, but alive. "I couldn't let you leave without me," he said, voice strained. "They're not invincible. We just have to be smarter." Together, the three of us moved with renewed purpose. Where before we had fled blindly, now we navigated with intention, using the knowledge Eli had shared about the layout and the guards' patrols. Hours later, we reached an old ventilation shaft, one Eli said led outside. It was narrow, claustrophobic, and filled with dust that caught in my throat, but it was our only chance. One by one, we crawled through the shaft, the darkness closing in on all sides, the sound of our own breathing loud in my ears. When we finally emerged, it was into a cold dawn, the sky a dull gray but unmistakably free. The asylum loomed behind us, a crumbling monolith to suffering and secrets. We didn't speak much as we stumbled toward the nearest road, where the first passing car slowed, its driver staring in disbelief at the three ragged figures emerging from the woods. "Help," Simon said simply. In the weeks that followed, the story we told was met with skepticism and disbelief. The authorities were slow to act, and the asylum's ruins remained largely untouched. But we refused to be silenced. Press interviews, anonymous tips, and the photographs I had taken, the evidence was undeniable. More survivors came forward, their voices shaking but resolute. The network of guards and captors unraveled, their power exposed and broken. For me, the experience left scars deeper than the bruises and cuts. The asylum had been a mirror, reflecting fears I hadn't known I carried, the terror of being watched, trapped, powerless. But it had also shown me the strength of connection, of trusting others even when everything seemed against us. Simon and I parted ways eventually, each of us chasing our own paths toward healing. Eli disappeared back into the shadows, his fate unknown, but his sacrifice never forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint echoes in my mind, the tapping footsteps, the whispered warnings. But I no longer feel hunted. Instead, I carry a quiet vigilance, a reminder that evil is not always monstrous or supernatural. Sometimes, it's just human, and that knowledge, as terrifying as it is, can be the beginning of resistance. The asylum stands empty now, a monument to cruelty and endurance. I visit it occasionally, not as a trespasser, but as a witness. The halls may crumble, the walls may rot, but the stories remain. And so do we, the survivors, the watchers, the ones who refuse to disappear. I am one of them. Story 4, Glass Walls, the Terror of Digital Stalking. I never thought much about how much time I spent online until it started to feel like the walls around me were made of glass. Lena was what you call a viral star. No one knew her personally, but everyone followed her. She was the kind of person who seemed to live in some perfect, sunlit bubble, always posting images of her latest coffee shop finds or breathtaking hikes. I didn't know why I felt so drawn to her, but I started noting patterns. When she'd post on Instagram, I'd check her TikTok within minutes. If she mentioned a place, I'd Google it. Over time, I learned the rhythm of her days better than my own. It was absurd, really. But it made me feel connected to something beyond the cramped studio apartment I called home. That Thursday started like any other. The sky outside was a dull, uniform gray, the kind that made the city feel cold and tired before noon. I sat on the threadbare couch, laptop balanced on my knees, headphones drowning out the hum of the refrigerator. I was deep into one of Lena's live streams, watching her try out a tiny, oddly decorated bakery in some part of town I'd never been to, when my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I frowned and set the laptop aside. It wasn't unusual to get spam or random messages. But this one was different. It was short. I see you. I blinked and reread it. The words felt oddly personal, like a whisper in a quiet room. I typed back with a cautious "who's this?" and waited. No response. I shrugged, assuming it was some prank or glitch, and went back to the live stream. Lena was laughing about how the bakery's owner insisted she try their secret recipe bread, which was apparently just bread with an excessive amount of garlic. The chat was buzzing with fans, the usual flood of heart emojis and jokes. But then my phone buzzed again. Another message. Don't pretend you don't know me. My heartbeat quickened. The room felt suddenly colder, though the heater was still humming steadily. I looked around the apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter, the cracked window that rattled softly with the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, but my fingers trembled as I typed, "Stop texting me." Then my phone chimed again. You can't hide. I'm closer than you think. I stared at the screen, the glow illuminating the worried crease between my eyebrows. It was impossible. Who would know? I was careful. My social media was locked down, my location services off. I didn't post much personal information beyond my carefully curated obsession with Lena. A sudden noise outside my window pulled my attention, a soft scraping, like something dragged along the brick wall. I looked up sharply, but the street below was empty, save for the usual litter of discarded coffee cups and the occasional passerby bundled in scarves. Nothing suspicious. Still, my skin prickled. I put my phone down and tried to focus on the live stream again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My apartment, which had always felt like a refuge of solitude, suddenly felt exposed. Later that night, after I'd shut off the laptop and the apartment had settled into silence, my phone buzzed once more. This time, a message appeared not as a text but as a notification from an app I'd never installed. Look outside. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to the window and peered into the darkness. Across the street, the dim glow of a street lamp cast long shadows. Nothing moved, nothing stood out. I turned away, heart pounding. Then my phone vibrated again. Now! I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat and slipped out into the corridor, locked the door behind me, and hurried down the stairs. The building was quiet, the faint sound of my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Outside, the street was still empty. A breeze tugged at my hair, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something metallic. I reached the sidewalk and scanned the shadows. Nothing. No one. Yet the feeling didn't leave me. It was as if someone was watching from just beyond the edge of the street lamp's reach, waiting for me to look away. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and sat down at the kitchen table, hands shaking as I stared at my phone. The messages had stopped. For now. But I knew this wasn't over. Someone had found a way in. Someone who wasn't just watching Lena Marlowe's every move, but mine. And worse, someone who knew things I hadn't told a soul. I glanced at the laptop, dark on the couch behind me. The glow of the screen when it woke up in sleep mode felt like eyes in the dark. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't just an obsession anymore. It was a trap. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Every instinct screamed to shut everything down, erase every trace, disappear. Yet, I couldn't. Not yet. There were answers buried in those files, in the messages I hadn't dared open. If I didn't find them first, whoever was watching would control the story and my fate. The night was closing in, but I was wide awake now, tangled deeper than ever. Fingers trembling, I reached for the laptop, its cold surface grounding me. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow over the cluttered desk. Lines of code in endless folders blurred before my eyes, but one file name stood out, a simple, unassuming title that hadn't been there yesterday. I clicked it open. A video played, grainy and distorted, but unmistakably familiar. Faces I recognized, friends, colleagues caught in moments that weren't meant to be shared. Whispers of secrets, betrayals, truths I had long suspected but never confirmed. My heart pounded as the realization sank in. I wasn't just a pawn, I was a key player. The trap wasn't closing around me, it was a cage I'd built myself, brick by brick, with every choice I'd made to dig deeper. Outside, the city hummed indifferently, unaware of the storm brewing in this small room. I swallowed hard, knowing that once I stepped through this door, there was no turning back. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand resting on the cold doorknob. The muffled hum of the city outside seeped through the cracked window, a stark contrast to the chaos roiling beneath my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to pretend none of this had ever come to light. But the truth was a weight I couldn't shed, no matter how desperately I wanted to. Taking a shaky breath, I turned the knob and stepped out into the narrow hallway. The dim light cast long shadows, twisting familiar shapes into something sinister. I could still hear the echoes of the conversation, the whispers of secrets, betrayals, and truths that had shattered the fragile foundation I'd built my life on. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me back to reality. It was a message from Mara. "Are you okay? We need to talk. Now." I hadn't spoken to Mara since that night at the bar, the night. By mid-morning, I forced myself to step away from the laptop. My hands were stiff, my neck cramped, and a dull ache throbbed behind my eyes. I needed coffee. The kind of strong, bitter stuff that numbs your senses just enough to make you feel alive. I grabbed my coat and headed out, the chill in the air doing little to soothe the knot tightening in my gut. At the cafe down the street, I sat in the corner booth, laptop open but untouched. My phone buzzed quietly in my pocket. I resisted the urge to check it immediately. Every notification felt like a trap now. But when I finally did, a single new message blinked on the screen. No sender, just a line of text. "You're looking too hard." They don't like that. Panic surged, but I forced myself to breathe. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't just watching, they were warning me. Or threatening me. Maybe both. I needed allies, but I had no one I could trust. Lena Marlowe, the influencer whose every move I had obsessively tracked, suddenly felt like a distant figure, a ghost I was chasing that might lead me nowhere, or worse, straight into danger. Back at my apartment, I sat with the laptop again, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I pulled up the folders I discovered the night before. There were dozens of files, photos, videos, audio clips, each more invasive than the last. The person behind this had access to everything, including my own devices. The thought alone made my skin crawl. I started cross-referencing timestamps, trying to piece together a timeline. Each file had been created between the hours I was supposed to be alone, asleep, or out of the house. Someone had been in my life, tracking me just as closely as I tracked Lena. A message popped up on my screen, a chat window I hadn't opened. The username was a string of random letters and numbers. The message read, "You're not as careful as you think." My heart jumped. How did they get in? I changed my passwords after the first messages, scanned my devices for malware. Nothing. Yet here they were, inside my digital life, watching. Listening. I shut the laptop abruptly, but the silence that followed was worse than the noise. My phone buzzed again. "We see everything. Even what you hide from yourself." That line hit me harder than I expected. What did they mean? What secrets was I hiding? I stared at my phone, half expecting the screen to flicker, to reveal some hidden camera feed. But there was nothing, just the cold glow of the message, waiting. I needed help. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? Someone is hacking me and sending creepy messages? It sounded paranoid. And what if they dismissed me? What if the person watching was closer than I imagined? I decided to reach out to someone I hadn't spoken to in months, Maya, an old friend from college who worked in cybersecurity. If anyone could help me figure out how my devices were compromised, it was her. My fingers trembled as I typed a short message, "I need help. Call me when you get this." Minutes passed. No reply. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, my phone rang. Maya's voice was cautious but steady. "Show me everything," she said. We arranged to meet at a small co-working space downtown. The place was loud with the hum of printers and murmur of freelancers typing away, but it felt safer than my apartment. I handed her the laptop and my phone, explaining what had happened as quickly as I could. Maya's brow furrowed as she pulled up the files. "This isn't just some random hacker," she said quietly. "This is someone with serious skills. Whoever did this bypassed multiple security layers. They're monitoring your devices in real time." I swallowed hard. Can they see me right now? Possibly. They could have camera access, mic access, anything. I felt exposed, like I was sitting naked in a room full of strangers. Why me? Why now? Maya shook her head. That's what we need to figure out. But whoever this is, they're patient and methodical. They want control. She ran diagnostics and started tracing IP addresses, but the results were frustratingly vague. The connection bounced through proxies and VPNs, layers of obfuscation designed to hide the true origin. "This is professional," Maya said grimly. "Maybe even someone you know." The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. As the day wore on, I felt the weight of eyes on me, not just through screens but in the real world. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a stranger lurking in the shadows. Every sound, footsteps on the stairs, a sudden knock at the door, made my heart leap. When I finally returned home, the apartment felt alien. The laptop sat where I left it, but the screen flickered faintly, as if it was breathing. I shut it down and unplugged everything. Then my phone buzzed again. A new message from an unknown number. You can't run. You're already inside the cage. I dropped the phone onto the couch, my breath shallow and fast. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered. And then, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, but even in the black, I felt a presence watching, waiting. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking uncontrollably. When the beam cut through the darkness, it landed on the laptop's screen, which, impossibly, had turned back on by itself. On the screen, a single message typed out in stark white letters. Let's play. The morning light was harsh, unwelcome even, slicing through the blinds in sharp, unforgiving lines. I stared at it like it was a riddle I couldn't solve. Who was they? Whoever was doing this wasn't just some faceless hacker in a basement somewhere. This felt personal. Too personal. I had no idea what kind of game I was supposed to be playing, but the rules were clear. I was trapped, and the cage was closing. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Unknown number. Did you like last night's move? You're slow. I swallowed, heart pounding in my throat. The message wasn't just a taunt, it was proof. Proof that they were watching me in real time, tracking my every reaction, waiting for me to slip. I called Maya as soon as I could. Her voice was steady, a lifeline amid the chaos. Anything new? I asked. She sighed. The IP tracing is going nowhere. Every lead disappears into a maze of proxies and VPNs. Whoever this is, they're a ghost. But I did find something else. My breath caught. What? There's an anomaly in your network traffic. It's subtle, like someone is siphoning data in tiny bits, constantly. But it's not from outside your home. It's coming from inside your own devices. Inside? I echoed. Yeah, Maya said. It looks like a backdoor has been installed on your router and your phone's firmware. Someone's got deep access, more than just a hacker on the other side of the world. They're inside your network, inside your house. I glanced around the apartment, suddenly paranoid. Every device, my phone, my laptop, the smart speaker in the corner, felt like a spy. Like an eye that never blinked. Can you trace it back? I asked. Not yet. Whoever set this up was careful. Probably planted it weeks ago, maybe months. They've been watching you for a long time. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. How long had this been going on? How many of my private moments, my secrets, had been stolen? I felt violated, exposed in a way I couldn't fix with passwords or firewalls. Listen, Maya said, voice softer now. You need to be careful. Don't connect to any public Wi-Fi. Don't plug in unknown devices. And don't, under any circumstances, go to sleep without shutting everything off. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I don't know who this is, Maya. Why me? There was a pause. Then she said, I have a theory. Before I could ask, she continued. Remember that influencer you've been tracking? The one your obsession started with? My lips tightened. Yeah. Well, I looked into their accounts, old posts, everything. And I found something strange. They don't just have fans, they have followers who are extreme. Some of them have histories of stalking, harassment, even criminal behavior. One of those people has been linked to the same kind of network infiltration tools we're seeing here. I felt a sick twist in my gut. Are you saying one of them is behind this? It's possible. Or someone connected to them. Someone obsessed enough to cross the line from digital stalking to active control. The idea made me want to scream. To run. But I knew I couldn't. I was already in the cage, and the bars were steel. Maya gave me instructions to wipe my devices with a secure tool she sent over. It'll take time, and you'll lose data, but it's the only way to cut the leash, maybe. I started the process, watching as files were deleted, systems restored. But the messages didn't stop. They came in waves, each more pointed, more specific. Did you think you could hide the photo from last summer? I'm still here. Your little secret about your sister. She won't stay quiet forever. I froze. How did they know? That photo was locked away in an offline folder, never uploaded or shared. The secret about my sister was something I told only a handful of people, and never online. Whoever this was had dug deep into my life, beyond just monitoring devices. Fear turned to rage. I wanted to fight back, but how? The more I resisted, the more they tightened their grip. It felt like drowning, struggling against invisible hands pulling me under. Then, late that evening, something else happened. I was lying on the couch, exhausted, phone in hand, when the screen suddenly flashed. A live video feed, grainy but unmistakable. It was my apartment, viewed from an angle I didn't recognize. I scrambled to identify the source, but the feed was anonymous, the camera moving slowly around the room, lingering on the door, the window, my laptop. A new message popped up beneath the video. Welcome to the endgame. You're not alone. I'm closer than you think. My breath hitched. I scanned the room, heart hammering. Was someone here with me? Was this footage live? Could they be standing behind me? I snapped the laptop shut and grabbed my phone, intent on calling Maya again. But the screen went black. Dead. No signal. No power. Nothing. In the sudden silence, a soft sound reached my ears, a low, deliberate tapping at the window. I didn't dare look. Didn't dare move. The cage had closed, and I was its prisoner. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I forced myself to meet the glass, heart pounding as a shadowy figure pressed a pale hand against the pane. Escape was slipping away. Morning came like a cruel joke. I forced myself to sit up, rubbing my face as if I could wipe away the nightmare. The apartment looked normal, too normal. No sign of forced entry, no disturbance, but I knew better. Whoever had been outside was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I tried the phone again. Nothing. No signal, no battery indicator, just a black screen. The laptop? Dead too. I checked every outlet, the power strip, even the circuit breaker. Everything was on, but neither device would turn on. It was as if someone had severed my connection to the world in the most absolute way possible. I felt utterly cut off. I needed help. I thought of Maya immediately. She was the only person I could trust, the one who had insisted I disconnect from this digital spiral. But with my devices dead, how could I reach her? And if someone was controlling my electronics, would my messages even reach her? Desperation pushed me out of the apartment. I grabbed my keys, the old landline phone in the kitchen drawer, and headed downstairs. The lobby was empty, the elevator too slow, so I took the stairs, counting the steps like a mantra to keep panic at bay. Outside, the city was waking up with its usual noise, the distant roar of traffic, the occasional shout, the clatter of footsteps on pavement. I pulled out the landline phone, but it was useless without a landline connection. My phone was dead. No signal meant no calls, no texts, no internet. I was trapped in a silent bubble. Then, as I stood on the sidewalk, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I spun around, heart pounding, scanning the street. People passed by, heads down, earbuds in, oblivious. But someone was there. A man in a dark jacket, standing just across the street, his gaze locked on me. There was something familiar about him, something that set my nerves on edge. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched. I forced my legs into motion, crossing the street briskly, keeping my eyes on him. When I reached the corner, he was gone. Was that real? Or just my mind playing tricks? I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on getting to a cafe with Wi-Fi. I needed to check my accounts to see if I could regain any control. I ducked into a small coffee shop, ordered a black coffee, and sat down at a corner table. I pulled out my backup phone, the one I kept in a drawer for emergencies. It was old, barely charged, but it worked. I powered it on, anxious to see if there was any signal. Nothing. No bars. No messages. No calls. I opened the browser, desperate to log into my email or social media. But every page refused to load. I tried again and again, my hands trembling. Then my backup phone buzzed. A notification from an unknown number. I stared, frozen. The message read, "Still trying to run? You don't get to choose." My throat tightened. The words were calm, but the threat was clear. I typed back, fingers shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" No reply. The cafe felt suddenly suffocating, the murmur of other customers distant and meaningless. I packed up my things and left, deciding to head to Maya's place. If anyone could help me, it was her. The walk to her apartment was a blur, my mind racing through every possible scenario. What if they were waiting for me there? What if the man I saw was connected to this? Was he following me now? When I reached her building, I hesitated outside the door, heart hammering in my chest. I needed to warn her, to tell her everything, but the words caught in my throat. I buzzed her apartment number. No answer. Buzzed again. Still nothing. I tried calling on my backup phone, no signal. Panic clawed at me. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Nothing. Then, a sound from inside, a soft, deliberate tapping at the window. My breath caught. I stepped back, heart pounding wildly. The tapping stopped. I reached for my phone to take a picture, to call someone, anyone. But before I could unlock it, the screen flashed. A grainy video feed appeared. This time, it wasn't my apartment. It was Maya's living room. Empty. Silent. The camera panned slowly, lingering on the couch, the bookshelf, the window. A message appeared beneath the feed. Your friend is safe, for now. But she's watching, and so am I. I dropped the phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I was no longer just a target. This was a game. A twisted power play with stakes I could barely comprehend. Suddenly, my backup phone vibrated again. A new message. Turn back, or the next live feed will be yours. I stared at the dark screen, feeling utterly powerless. Behind me, footsteps approached the soft, measured steps of someone who knew exactly where I was. I didn't dare turn around. The cage was closing tighter than ever. And this time, escape felt impossible. A cold sweat trickled down my spine as the realization settled in. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control, humiliation, and watching me unravel piece by piece. My mind raced, searching for any overlooked detail, any sliver of hope. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay silent, to become invisible in the shadows. But deep down, I knew the game had only just begun. The morning light spilled unevenly through the blinds when I finally dared to open my eyes. Maya was safe. That was something. The message on my screen hadn't been a lie. But the fact that someone had been inside her apartment, had been watching her through her own devices, left a raw sting of violation that went beyond fear. It was personal now, intimate in a way I couldn't shake. I got up with cautious movements, avoiding the shadows near the door where I'd last heard footsteps. The backup phone lay on the table, screen cracked from the drop, but still alive with a blinking notification. I hesitated before reaching for it, my fingers trembling. The message was simple: you're smarter than most. Let's see if you can finish the game. No sender ID. No timestamp. I knew then this wasn't going to end with a single confrontation. It was far from over. But I wasn't going to let it consume me anymore. I spent the day locked inside, barricading my digital life piece by piece. I changed every single password, logged out of every account, and set up new email addresses under pseudonyms. I disconnected smart devices one by one: camera, speakers, even the smart thermostat, anything that could be used to spy on me. It was exhausting, frustrating, and yet it gave me a sliver of control. Still, the paranoia lingered. Every creak in the building, every shadow flickering past the blinds, set my nerves jangling. I wanted to tell Maya everything, to reach out and make sure she was truly okay. But after the silence at her door and the chilling live feed, I wasn't sure if she even wanted to talk to me, or if she was still being watched. In the evening, I forced myself out of the apartment and went to a nearby cafe, a place with no Wi-Fi, no cameras, just the hum of conversation and the clatter of cups. I needed human presence without digital intrusion. There, I scribbled notes in a small notebook, piecing together the timeline and every detail I remembered: the messages, the tapping, the video feeds. I tried to make sense of the man I'd seen, the one whose footsteps had followed me. What was his connection to this? Why target me, and why use Maya as a pawn? The answer came slowly, like the turning of a key in a lock. Later that night, I got a call on my landline, something I had left connected out of habit. The voice was low, calm, and disturbingly familiar. "Why are you running?" I swallowed hard, heart racing. The voice wasn't a stranger's. It was someone I'd known long ago. Someone I thought was gone from my life. "I'm not running," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then stop hiding," the voice said. "You're not the only one who knows how to watch." I pressed the receiver tighter, the weight of years crashing down on me. The person on the other end wasn't just an observer, they were a player too, a ghost from my past who had been tracking me all along. The secrets they knew, the power they wielded through technology, had been a weapon, a means of control that I'd failed to see until now. They wanted to scare me, to break me. But they underestimated what desperation can fuel. The next morning, I reached out to Maya. After hours of silence, her voice came through, soft, wary, but alive. She told me she had cut off all her devices, that she was staying with a friend out of the city for a while. She didn't want me to come looking for her. It was safer that way. I understood. I promised to keep her updated, to stay vigilant. But this time, I would do it on my terms. With new resolve, I started working with a cybersecurity expert I found through a trusted friend. Together, we traced the digital footprints left by my stalker, piecing together clues hidden in the messages, the timing, the patterns. It took weeks. Every lead felt like a thread in a tangled web, but eventually, we found enough to alert the authorities. A warrant was issued. The man was arrested, not some ghostly figure lurking in the shadows, but a real person living a few blocks away, obsessed and dangerous. He had hacked into my devices, into Maya's, and several others connected to us, using a combination of phishing schemes and malware tailored to bypass security measures. His motive was twisted jealousy and control, a desire to dominate lives through fear and surveillance. The trial was grueling, but it was also cathartic. Sitting in the courtroom, watching him deny the anonymity he'd taken so much comfort in, I felt a heavy weight lift. The judge sentenced him to years behind bars, and the digital evidence ensured no loopholes. I realized then that the horror wasn't just in the stalking or the invasion, it was in the silence, the isolation, the feeling that no one could see or understand what was happening. But I had made noise. I had fought back. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life deliberately. I stopped obsessively tracking the influencer who had been the initial obsession that led me down this path. I limited my social media use, focusing instead on real-world connections and boundaries. Maya and I healed in our own ways, our friendship tempered by trauma but strengthened by honesty. She moved to a new city, took up a job that didn't require constant digital presence, and we kept in touch by letter, old-fashioned, tangible, and safe. I learned to live without the constant hum of a screen in my face, without the illusion of control that came with endless scrolling and monitoring. I found peace in the quiet moments, in the unpredictability of real life unscripted. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping, the echo of a presence that once haunted my every move. But now, it feels distant, like a shadow I can acknowledge without fear. I am no longer a prisoner of my own devices. No longer an audience to a cruel voyeur's game. I am free. And with freedom came a new kind of strength, the courage to face the world unfiltered, untracked, and undeniably alive. Story 5, Millfield Mill Secrets, Haunting Past Unveiled. The house was smaller than I remembered from the photographs, but that wasn't surprising. Moving to Millfield felt like the kind of leap I needed. After years of the city's endless noise and flickering neon lights, I craved quiet. I wanted space, both physical and mental. Millfield was that space, a small town tucked between rolling hills and dense woodlands, far from the rush of highways and crowds. The nearest stoplight was 15 miles away. The streets were lined with cracked sidewalks and aging maples, their branches thick with early autumn leaves. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, and strangers were rare enough to draw attention. I'd arrived just 2 days earlier, hauling boxes from the rental truck into the cramped kitchen, when I noticed the old factory chimney looming over the treetops about a mile down the valley. It was a rust-red column, scarred and weathered, standing like a monument to a forgotten past. The locals called it the Millfield Mill, a name that sounded more like a quaint tourist spot than the relic of decades-old industry it really was. I asked about it once, casually, while buying groceries. The woman behind the counter, her name tag read Ellen, paused just a second too long before changing the subject. Something about her hesitation settled on me like a cold shadow. That evening, I wandered down the main street, passing the post office, a diner with flickering neon letters, and the town library, where an elderly man was stacking books behind the counter. The silence was unusual. Not the peaceful kind you'd expect in a small town, but a heavy, almost watchful quiet. People smiled politely but avoided eye contact. Conversations ended abruptly if I lingered too long. When I asked about the factory again, the answers were clipped or vague. "It's been closed for years," someone said, eyes darting away. "Best to let sleeping dogs lie," another muttered under breath, as if I hadn't heard. Curiosity gnawed at me. That night, after unpacking the last box, I pulled out my laptop and started digging. Newspaper archives, old town records, anything mentioning Millfield Mill. It wasn't long before I found the first mention of the accident, a headline from nearly 40 years ago. Factory explosion devastates Millfield, several missing, cause unknown. The story was brief, dated, and surprisingly sparse on details. The official report cited a gas leak and structural failure, but no names were listed among the missing. Instead, there were vague references to workers and employees, as if the victims were faceless statistics. I bookmarked the article and leaned back, the glow of the screen casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Something about the way the town avoided the subject felt less like discretion and more like fear. I kept thinking about Ellen's eyes, the clipped answers, the way conversations dried up whenever the factory came up. It wasn't just embarrassment or sorrow, it felt like a warning. The next morning, I decided to take a walk toward the factory ruins. The air was crisp, with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As I approached the overgrown lot where the mill once operated, the landscape changed. The neat rows of houses and manicured lawns gave way to wild grass and shattered concrete. The skeletal remains of the factory buildings stood jagged against the sky, their broken windows resembling empty eye sockets. I noticed a faded sign nailed to a rusted pole, private property and no trespassing. I hesitated, my heart quickening. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, proof of the accident, perhaps, or clues to the town's silence. But as I circled the perimeter, I spotted fresh tire tracks in the mud and discarded cigarette butts near a hidden trail leading deeper into the woods. Someone had been here recently. The thought unsettled me, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. On my way back, I stopped by Millfield's only diner for a late lunch. The place was nearly empty, save for a few locals hunched over coffee cups. I sat at the counter and ordered a sandwich, trying to blend into the quiet hum of the room. An older man with a weathered face and thick glasses slid onto the stool next to me. He didn't say much at first, just nodded politely when I greeted him, but when I mentioned the factory in passing, his hand tightened around his cup. "Don't go poking around where you're not wanted," he said quietly, voice low enough that only I could hear. "Some things are better left alone." I forced a smile, nodding, but inside I felt a thrill of unease. Who was he? And how many others in this town shared his warning? The diner's front door jingled as a young woman entered, her eyes scanning the room before settling on me with a brief, unreadable glance. That night, lying awake in the creaky old house, I stared out the window at the distant silhouette of the factory chimney. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden. I thought about the missing workers, the OSHT warnings, and the fresh signs of recent activity near the ruins. Something about Millfield wasn't right. The town's silence was louder than any noise I'd heard since arriving, and I could feel it pressing in, waiting for me to ask the wrong question. I didn't yet know what that question was, but I knew I had to find out. The morning arrived in a slow crawl of gray light that seeped through the curtains. I dressed quickly and walked toward the diner, the same place where the older man had issued his warning. The streets were empty, the town sluggish in the morning chill, as if reluctant to start the day. I passed a cluster of houses with peeling paint and sagging porches, their windows dark like the eyes of the factory. I felt the weight of silence pressing in again, thick and expectant. Inside the diner, the scent of coffee and frying bacon wrapped around me like a familiar cloak, but the atmosphere was colder than it had been the day before. The few patrons inside glanced up briefly before returning to their meals and muttered conversations. The older man with the glasses wasn't there, but the young woman from yesterday sat at a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up as I approached, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, sliding into the booth opposite her. She hesitated, then nodded. You're the one asking questions. I swallowed, unsure if that was a statement or a warning. Do you know anything about the factory? I asked, voice low. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back to me. People don't like to talk about it. Not here. Why not? She shrugged, but her jaw clenched. Because it's not just history. It's still affecting us. People disappeared after the accident, some never came back. The ones who asked too many questions. I nodded slowly. I've noticed. She glanced around, then leaned in. You need to be careful. There are some who want that past buried, and they don't mind who gets in the way. A shiver ran down my spine. Do you know who? Before she could answer, the door to the diner swung open with a sharp jingle. A tall man in a dark jacket stepped inside, scanning the room briefly before his gaze settled on us. The woman's expression tightened instantly. Looks like you've already got company, she murmured, standing abruptly. She dropped some bills on the table and slipped out before I could ask more. I watched her go, then turned to see the man approaching. His eyes were cold, calculating. New around here, he said, voice even but firm. I'd advise you to drop whatever you're digging into. Why? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Because some things are better left alone, he repeated, echoing the older man's warning from the day before. I didn't back down. I want to know what really happened at the factory. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. He left as abruptly as he'd come, and I was left with a gnawing sense of dread that settled deep in my chest. Determined not to be intimidated, I spent the afternoon at the town's small library. The building smelled of dust and old paper, a comforting refuge from the quiet menace outside. I pulled out old newspapers and town records, scanning for any mention of the factory accident. The event had been reported in brief: an explosion that killed several workers, followed by a swift closure. But there was a puzzling scarcity of details. Names were listed, but there were no follow-up stories, no investigations, no public memorial. It was as if the town had collectively agreed to erase the incident from memory. I copied names and dates onto a pad, cross-referencing with the few surviving records of workers' families. One name caught my eye: Henry Calloway, a foreman who had vanished shortly after the accident. No obituary, no mention in town records beyond the day of the blast. I made a note to ask about him, though I was already certain the answers wouldn't come easily. Later, as I left the library, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the streets. I noticed a figure standing across the road, watching me from the edge of the woods. When I looked directly at him, he disappeared among the trees before I could get a good look. My pulse quickened. Someone was definitely keeping an eye on me. I decided to visit the local hardware store next, a place where townsfolk might speak more freely in passing. The bell jingled as I entered, and the owner, a grizzled man named Tom, looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice gruff but not unfriendly. "I'm looking for any information about the factory accident from years ago," I said carefully. Tom's expression tightened, and he set down the wrench he'd been holding. "That's not something folks around here talk about much." "I understand, but I'm trying to piece together what really happened." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I knew some of the men who worked there. Good men. The explosion wasn't an accident, if that's what you're asking. It was negligence, cut corners, safety ignored to save money. Some people wanted to cover it up. That's why the silence. Did anyone face consequences?" Tom laughed bitterly. "If they did, I don't know about it. But those who pushed too hard for the truth, they just disappeared. Folks stopped asking after that. A chill ran through me. Disappeared? Tom nodded solemnly. No one ever found them. Like they vanished into thin air. I left the store with a heavy feeling settling over me. The warnings weren't just idle threats, they were grounded in real fear and real danger. The factory accident was more than a tragedy, it was a wound the town had tried to bury, and anyone who tried to dig it up risked being swallowed by the silence. That night, back at the house, I sat by the window with my notes spread around me. The wind picked up, rattling the loose panes and carrying with it the distant, muffled sounds of the town settling into darkness. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Stop digging. I stared at the screen, the words sinking in. Whoever was watching me was not bluffing. And yet, I couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, tangled in decades of fear and secrets. But how deep was the darkness I was poking at? And how long before I, too, might vanish without a trace? The morning light came pale and hesitant through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. I needed more information, and I knew Tom wasn't the only person who held pieces of this puzzle. If the town was this tight-lipped, I had to find someone who might be willing to talk, someone who wasn't so easily cowed by the fear or threats. I thought about Mrs. Carmichael, the librarian. She was older, maybe in her 70s, and had lived here for as long as anyone could remember. People trusted her, maybe because she was harmless on the surface. But I figured a librarian's curiosity might be sharper than most. I grabbed my coat and stepped out, the air crisp and biting. The streets were quiet, but not empty. An old man was sweeping his porch a few houses down, and a dog barked somewhere off in the distance. I tried to look casual, but I felt eyes on me, furtive glances from behind curtains, quick looks from doorways. The library was a brick building that looked like it hadn't changed since the 60s, with peeling paint on the sign and a bell that jingled cheerfully when I pushed open the door. Mrs. Carmichael was behind the counter, hunched over a ledger, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Good morning," I said, trying for a friendly tone. "I'm looking into the factory accident from a few decades ago. I was wondering if you might have any local records or newspapers about it." Her eyes flicked up, sharp and clear despite her age. "That's a touchy subject around here. Not many like to stir up old ghosts." "I understand, but I'm just trying to understand what happened. Maybe even why people disappeared after asking questions." She sighed, closing the ledger with deliberate care. "Come with me." I followed her through the stacks, past the well-worn rows of books and into a small back room. She pulled out a faded box from a shelf and set it on the table. "These are clippings from the local paper," she said quietly. "I kept them hidden because I didn't want to bring trouble on myself, but maybe it's time someone knew." I opened the box carefully. Inside were yellowed newspapers, their edges brittle. The headlines were grim: "Factory explosion kills dozens, investigation launched into safety violations, missing factory workers raise fears." I began flipping through the pages, piecing together fragments of the story. The explosion had killed 23 workers instantly. The investigation had stalled after a few months, with reports of evidence disappearing and witnesses changing their statements. Then came the disappearances, men who had worked at the factory, men who had spoken out, gone missing one by one. Did anyone ever try to expose what really happened? I asked. Mrs. Carmichael hesitated, then nodded. There was a man, Frank Ellery. He was an engineer at the factory, outspoken and determined. He tried to get the truth out. After he started asking questions, he vanished. No one ever found him. I looked closer at his picture in the paper, a stern, serious face, eyes full of resolve. The last article about him was dated 6 months after the explosion. "Do you know where he lived?" I asked. Down by the old Knoll Road, she said. His house was abandoned soon after. Folks say it's haunted, but that's just stories to keep kids away. I felt a sudden urgency. If I could find that house, maybe I could find something Ellery left behind, a journal, a letter, anything that could shed light on what the factory owners were hiding. Thank you, I said, gathering the papers. I'll be careful. As I left the library, the weight of the box in my bag felt heavier than it should. The silence of the town pressed in on me again, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were still watching, waiting. I decided to take the long route to the house, through the woods that lined the edge of town. The trees were bare now, skeletal branches reaching out like fingers. The path was uneven, strewn with dead leaves and fallen twigs, and every crunch beneath my boots sounded too loud. When I reached the edge of the trees, the house came into view. It was worse than I had imagined, weathered and sagging, windows boarded up or broken, paint peeling in long strips. The porch leaned perilously, and the door hung slightly ajar. I hesitated at the threshold, the chill in the air matching the unease tightening in my chest. This was no longer just research, it was trespassing into someone else's guarded territory. But I needed to know. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. I shone my flashlight around the room, catching glimpses of old furniture draped with sheets, broken picture frames, and a scattering of papers on a rickety desk. I moved toward the desk, heart pounding. The papers were faded and fragile letters, engineering notes, calculations. One folder was labeled Safety Reports in Ellery's handwriting. I opened it carefully and began reading. The documents detailed a pattern of ignored safety violations, equipment failures, and management's deliberate suppression of reports to keep production going. Worse, there were notes about a dangerous chemical leak days before the explosion, something the company had covered up to avoid shutdown. A sudden noise made me freeze, a floorboard creaking upstairs. Someone else was here. I grabbed the folder and slipped it into my bag. I needed to get out, fast. I moved toward the door, but it slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The house was no longer empty. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if the intruder was friend or foe, but one thing was clear, I had crossed a line. The silence was no longer just a warning, it was a threat, and now it was closing in around me. The footsteps above grew heavier, deliberate. I fumbled for my phone, but no signal. The walls seemed to close in as the weight of the town's secrets pressed down, and I realized that asking questions had already put me in danger far greater than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about staying alive. The moment the door slammed shut behind me, the house seemed to contract, the shadows folding in tighter, swallowing the stale air. I shoved my bag tighter against my side, feeling the bulk of the folder pressing insistently under my arm. I tried my phone again. No signal. No Wi-Fi. Nothing but the dead silence of this place, broken only by those slow, deliberate footsteps above. I had to move, had to get out. But the porch door was stuck, swollen with moisture and neglect. I yanked at the handle, but it refused to budge. Then I heard the footsteps pause, directly above me. The floorboard creaked, a warning or a threat, I couldn't tell. I backed away from the door, eyes adjusting to the gloom, searching for another way out. A narrow hallway led deeper into the house. My flashlight flickered as I moved toward it, every breath shallow, my skin prickling with cold sweat. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar, revealing a cramped kitchen. The faint smell of rusted metal and something sour, old food, maybe, hit me as I stepped inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, heart racing. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the staircase. Whoever was upstairs had to come down eventually. I needed a plan. In the kitchen, a window faced the overgrown backyard. It was old and grimy, but not boarded up. I tested the latch. It clicked open with surprising ease. The glass was dirty but intact. I crouched down and pushed at the frame. It gave way slightly, but a second later, a loud crash came from the hallway. Someone was coming. I scrambled back, just as the door to the kitchen swung open. A man stood there, his face shadowed but his presence unmistakably hostile. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a faded plaid shirt and jeans, ice hard and cold. The kind of look that didn't welcome visitors or questions. Thought you'd sneak around, huh? His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. I swallowed hard. I'm looking into the factory accident. I didn't mean to trespass. He took a step forward, and I could see the scars on his knuckles, the way his jaw clenched. Nobody looks into that. Not anymore. My mind raced. I could try to talk my way out, but I knew from the town's silence and the stories swirling in my head that this man wasn't here to chat. The folder under my arm felt like a grenade. Why? What happened there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed, but it was hollow, bitter. You don't want to know. People who dig up the past don't stick around long. You're lucky you're still standing. The window called to me, a desperate escape route. I edged toward it, keeping my eyes on him. He noticed. Going somewhere? Before I could react, he lunged. I dodged, heart leaping into my throat. The kitchen was small. There was nowhere to run. I grabbed a rolling pin off the counter and swung it blindly. It connected with a grunt, and he staggered back. That bought me a second to wrench the window fully open and climb through, scraping my hands on the rough wood. The cold night air hit me like a shock, and I dropped onto the damp grass, scrambling away from the house as fast as I could. Behind me, the man shouted, but I didn't look back. I ran through the overgrown yard, my breath ragged, the folder still clutched tightly. Somewhere in the dark, headlights flicked on a truck idling at the edge of the property. I ducked behind a bush, heart pounding as the truck door slammed. Footsteps approached the house, slow and deliberate. I pressed my back into the cold earth, willing myself to be invisible. The truck's engine roared to life, tires crunching over gravel as it pulled away. Silence settled again, thick and suffocating. I stayed hidden until the first light of dawn, when I finally dared to move. The town felt different in daylight, less menacing, but only just. I needed help, someone who might understand what I was up against. Back at the cafe, I found Marla behind the counter. She looked up, surprised to see me so early. "Rough night?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. I hesitated, then nodded. "I need to know everything about the factory. The accident, what happened afterward, and why no one talks about it." Her face tightened, eyes darting around like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Some things are better left alone," she said quietly. "You've stirred up trouble, you know that, right?" "I have to keep going," I said. "People disappeared. You know that, don't you?" Marla looked away, voice barely a whisper. "They keep the silence to protect themselves. But the ones who ask questions, they don't get answers. They just vanish." I leaned in. "Who?" She swallowed hard, then glanced toward the door. "You're not the only one poking around. There was a man, a journalist. Came through a few months ago. He wanted to write the truth. Now no one's seen him." The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket. The stakes were higher than I thought. This wasn't just a story, it was a trap. "Why did you help me?" I asked. "If this is so dangerous." Marla's eyes met mine, steady and fierce. "Because someone has to remember. Someone has to keep asking. Even if it costs them everything." Her words gave me a flicker of hope and a storm of dread. Outside, the quiet town carried on as if nothing had happened. But I knew better now. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of waiting. Waiting for the next person who dared to pry. Waiting for me. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running before I disappeared too. I woke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the window pane, a gentle rhythm that felt distant and foreign after the past few days of relentless tension. After my conversation with Marla, I had spent the better part of the night piecing together what little I could from half-forgotten news clippings and brittle town records I'd managed to scavenge from the library's dusty archives. The factory accident and explosion that had ripped through the plant decades ago was no mere industrial tragedy. It had been a cover-up, meticulously maintained by a network of influential town elders and corporate interests. The disappearances were silenced witnesses, whistleblowers, or anyone who threatened to pry too deeply. It was a brutal system of control disguised beneath layers of polite smiles and quiet nods. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst was how I'd become a part of it. I dressed quickly, the rain now a steady downpour, and stepped outside. The town was practically deserted, the streets slick and shining under the gray sky. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer, now while the threat still loomed like a shadow just beyond the edge of sight. But I owed it to the missing to see this through. I made my way back to Marla's cafe, the only place that felt remotely like a refuge. She was already there, cleaning tables with a deliberate calm that belied the tension in her eyes. "I'm going back to the factory," I said, voice low, as I sat across from her. "There's something there I need to find, proof. Something that will force them to stop this." Marla's gaze didn't waver. "It's dangerous. They watch everything. If they catch you—" "I know," I interrupted. "But if I don't, they win. And more people will disappear. I can't let that happen." She nodded slowly, then reached under the counter and handed me a small envelope. "This was left for you," she said. "A few months ago, the journalist who came through, he passed it to me before he vanished. Said it might help someone brave enough to carry on." My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a USB drive and a faded photograph of the factory's manager standing beside a stern-looking man in a dark suit. On the back, a scrawled note, "Find the ledger." It's all there. The ledger. I remembered mentions of it in the town records, the factory's financial book rumored to contain incriminating evidence of illegal dumping, bribery, and hush money paid to silence victims' families. If I could get my hands on that ledger, I could expose everything. "We'll go together," Marla said suddenly, surprising me. I can't just sit and watch anymore. Relief and gratitude swelled inside me. For the first time since arriving, I felt less alone. As dusk fell, we slipped through the shadows toward the abandoned factory. The building loomed like a relic of forgotten nightmares, its broken windows staring blankly into the gathering night. The air smelled faintly of rust and decay. Inside, the silence was oppressive. We moved carefully, Marla's flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Memories of the explosion echoed in the charred walls and twisted metal, but it was the back office that held the prize, a locked filing cabinet hidden beneath layers of dust and neglect. I fumbled with the keys Marla had brought, heart pounding. The lock clicked open, revealing stacks of yellowed papers and ledgers. I quickly found what I was looking for, the ledger, thick with detailed records of payments, correspondences, and names. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the hall. We froze. A figure appeared, tall and imposing, ice cold in the dim light. "I should have known you'd come back," he said, voice low and menacing. It was the man from the photo, the factory manager, or what was left of his dignity. Marla stepped forward, her voice steady. "It's over. We have the ledger, and we're taking it to the authorities." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think anyone will believe you? This town protects its own. You're just another fool who doesn't understand how things work here." I felt a surge of anger, the fear melting away. "Maybe. But we have proof now. And I'm done running." The man's eyes flickered, calculating. Then, unexpectedly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't wait. Clutching the ledger and the USB drive, we fled the factory and made our way to the sheriff's office, where the storm had brought the few remaining townsfolk indoors. The sheriff listened, his face grim as we laid out the evidence. After tense hours, he finally agreed to open an investigation. The news spread slowly, the town's silence cracking like fragile glass. In the following weeks, the factory manager and several others were arrested. Families of the disappeared found some answers, and the town began to reckon with its past. For me, the experience changed everything. I had arrived as an outsider, desperate for a quiet place to start over, but I left with scars deeper than I'd imagined. Yet, there was also a fierce sense of purpose, a reminder that silence can be deadly, but so can courage. Marla and I stayed in touch, bound by what we'd endured. The town would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, it could heal. As I packed my bags to leave, I looked out at the rain-cleansed streets, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and hope. I was no longer running from the darkness, I was carrying its weight, and with it, the resolve to keep shining a light. Because sometimes, surviving isn't just about escaping. It's about standing your ground, even when the silence wants to swallow you whole. Story 6, The Faceless Hosts, Deceptive Village Strangers. The morning air was crisp in the village of 𝐾𝐨𝐧'𝐭, biting gently at the edges of my thin jacket as I stepped out of the guest house. I slung my backpack over one shoulder and squinted down the street toward the small market square. Already, a handful of villagers had begun setting up stalls, their voices blending into a low murmur that mingled with the distant clatter of a woodcutter's axe. I was alone, as usual, my footsteps the only echo in the quiet dawn. Backpacking had become a habit, a way to escape the humdrum routines I'd left behind without quite knowing what I was looking for. I told myself it was discovery, but sometimes it felt more like running. The remote villages were my refuge, places where people moved slower and the world seemed less urgent. 𝐾𝐨𝐧'𝐭 was no different. I liked that. At the market, I picked up a piece of fruit from a woman who smiled shyly and nodded when I greeted her in the few words of the local language I'd managed to pick up. I sat on a low stone wall, savoring the tart sweetness as I watched the village wake up around me. It was peaceful, safe, normal. That afternoon, I wandered up the dirt path that led out of town toward the woods. I wasn't sure where I was going, but the quiet pull of the trees invited me deeper. The forest was dense here, the canopy thick enough to blot out the sun in places, leaving the ground cool and shadowed. I moved slowly, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional chirp of a bird. After an hour, I came across a small clearing where a fire had recently burned down to embers. Nearby, a simple wooden bench had been carved from a fallen log, and on it sat a battered notebook, its pages yellowed and edges curled. Curiosity won out, and I flipped it open. The handwriting was neat but hurried, entries dated back several months. The author was another traveler, someone who had been passing through this same area. They wrote about the beauty of the villages, the kindness of strangers, the feeling of being somewhere untouched by time. But then the tone shifted. The last few entries spoke of discomfort, a mounting unease about the people they'd met, friendly at first, but with details that never quite lined up. Names changed, stories contradicted themselves, and the traveler's tone grew paranoid, almost fearful. I closed the notebook, a chill creeping up my spine despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. It seemed too coincidental, finding this here, left behind like a warning. I looked around, half expecting someone to appear from the trees, but the clearing was empty except for the faint scent of smoke and damp earth. That night, back in the guest house, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The room was small and simple, with a single bed and a wooden chair pushed against the wall. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks in the shutters, carrying the distant sounds of the village settling into sleep. I checked my phone, no signal, as usual, and then my notebook, the one I carried with me to record the places I'd been, the people I'd met. I flipped through the pages, trying to anchor myself in the familiarity of my own words. But even as I read, I couldn't ignore the growing unease, the way the shadows seemed to press in closer, the way the stories from the notebook and the clearing replayed in my mind. There was a knock at the door. I froze, heart pounding. It was late. Visitors were rare here, especially at night. I hesitated, then moved cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. Outside stood a man, his face partially obscured by the dim lantern light. He smiled, a slow, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Traveling alone?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I nodded, stepping back from the door. "Stories," he said, as if that explained everything. "I have some to share." "We all do." The unease that had been simmering all day boiled over. I wanted to close the door, to lock it tight and pretend none of this was happening. But something in his gaze held me there, a strange insistence that I couldn't look away from. "Why are you here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, then tapped his chest lightly. "Looking for company. For stories. For understanding." The door creaked open a fraction when I moved aside, and he stepped in, the shadows swallowing him whole. That's when I realized I wasn't the only traveler who'd come through 𝐾𝐨, and I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the inconsistencies. The friendly faces, the eager storytellers, they weren't just passing through. They were part of something else, something I wasn't ready to understand. And now, I was caught in the middle. The fire flickered, casting long, restless shadows across the walls as silence thickened between us. He took a slow step forward, eyes searching mine as if weighing the risk of trust. "You've seen the cracks," he whispered, voice barely audible over the wind outside. "The town's smile hides the fractures beneath, a secret older than any of us." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of unspoken truths pressing in. Whatever this was, it was bigger than I imagined, and I was already entwined. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains, casting pale stripes across the worn floorboards. I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, calm, but calculating, and the way he'd said, "The town's smile hides the fractures beneath." There was something he knew that I didn't. Something that tied the stories, the travelers, and the disappearances together. I had to find out what. I packed my bags slowly, every movement deliberate. Outside, the village of 𝐾𝐨 was waking. The usual bustle of market stalls and shouting vendors filled the narrow streets. The faces were bright, welcoming, but beneath the surface, I felt the same unease, like a thread pulled too tight. I needed to talk to others, to see if anyone else had noticed the strange patterns, if anyone else had been watching. At the small cafe near the square, I ordered black coffee and sat watching the steady stream of locals and tourists. I overheard snatches of conversation, mostly about the weather, the harvest, the mundane, but then a woman's voice caught my attention. She spoke quietly to her companion, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Another one gone," she said. "That's the third this month. The young man by the river." I tightened my grip on the cup. Disappearances. They weren't just isolated incidents. They were piling up. I introduced myself when the woman left, approaching cautiously. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear." "What do you mean, gone?" Her eyes flicked to mine, suspicion tempered with a flicker of relief. "People leave town. Sometimes they don't come back. Usually travelers, like you." She hesitated, then whispered, "Or the ones who get too curious." A chill ran through me. "Have you noticed anything? Anything that connects them?" She shook her head. "Everyone says different things. Some say they just got tired, others say they were taken. But no one talks openly, not here. It's best to keep quiet." Her warning settled over me like a thick fog. If the villagers were too scared to speak, how deep did this go? I needed more than whispers. I needed proof. Later, I wandered to the edge of the village where the river curved beneath the trees. The spot where the last missing traveler had been seen. The ground was soft and damp, trampled by many feet, but I found something, a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn, faded and torn. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling the weight of it like a clue dropped from the shadows. Back in the village, I saw out the small library, hoping to find records or old newspapers. The librarian was an elderly man with cautious eyes. When I asked about the disappearances, he sighed, lowering his voice. "There have always been stories," he said. "But lately, something's changed. Travelers come looking for stories, and some never leave. It's not just chance. There's a pattern, a network, some say." "A network?" I echoed, heart pounding. He nodded slowly. "People who prey on the lost. They find you when you don't want to be found. They offer friendship, company, stories, but it's a trap." I swallowed hard. The pieces were clicking into place. The friendly travelers weren't just passing through. They were part of this network, luring others in. But why? And how? That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I returned to the clearing where I'd first found the notebook. The pages were damp from the morning's mist, but the ink was still legible. I traced the names and dates, each one tied to a traveler who had vanished. The handwriting changed, but the message was clear, a warning buried beneath the stories, a desperate attempt to connect the dots. Suddenly, a whisper of movement behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one. Just the rustling leaves and the settling dusk. Yet the feeling lingered, a presence watching, waiting. I knew then that I was being followed. The network had noticed me. I couldn't stay in 𝐾𝐨 any longer. But leaving wasn't simple. The roads out twisted through dense forests and steep hills, and I had no idea who I could trust. The friendly faces I'd met felt like masks, hiding something darker beneath. As night fell, I packed my bag once more, stuffing in the notebook and the scrap of fabric. The stories I collected were no longer just tales, they were evidence. And the clock was ticking. A sudden knock sounded at the door again. Not hesitant this time, but deliberate, urgent. I froze, the shadows closing in once more. The door creaked open, and a familiar smile greeted me, one that didn't reach the eyes. "We need to talk," the voice said. "Before it's too late." I hesitated, heart pounding, then stepped aside to let the figure in. The dim room suddenly felt colder, the air thick with unspoken threats. "Who else knows?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The visitor's gaze flicked toward the window, then back to me. "More than you realize. They're already watching." My mind raced, every shadow outside, every passerby suddenly suspicious. We had no time for trust, only urgency. "Tell me everything," I urged, bracing myself for the truth that would change everything. The visitor hesitated, then pulled a folded map from their coat, edges worn and stained. "This," they said, "is where it all began." The visitor unfolded the map carefully on the cracked wooden table, its creases worn like the lines on an old traveler's weathered face. "This is 𝐾𝐨, the visitor said, tapping a spot near the center of the map. "But look here." Their finger traced a thin red line, a path I hadn't seen before, leading away from 𝐾𝐨 through a series of smaller, nameless dots. "These are villages. Remote, scattered. Every one of them tied to disappearances." I stared at the map, trying to absorb what they were saying. "You think this network operates across all these places?" They nodded. "And not just operates. Controls. They've been using the same routes for years, picking travelers off one by one." Their voice was low but urgent. "Your notebook, I've seen it before. Someone tried to expose them but vanished soon after." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The notebook in my bag suddenly felt heavier, like it carried more than ink and paper. It was a burden, a warning. "Why show me this?" I asked, voice barely steady. "Because you're next if you don't leave. But more than that, you might be the only one who can do something." I swallowed hard. I don't even know who they are, or why they do this. I can't fight something I don't understand. The visitor's eyes locked onto mine, steady and unyielding. "You have to understand. These aren't random acts. It's organized. Calculated. They prey on people like us, strangers who wander too far, trusting too easily. We're ghosts to them, but sometimes someone slips through the cracks." A slow, sinking realization settled over me. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I'd stepped into a game with stakes far beyond anything I'd imagined. The visitor leaned back, rubbing their temples. "I came here because I had to find someone who knew the stories, who might connect the dots. You did that. But now, they know you're looking." I glanced toward the window, the night pressed tight against the glass. "So what do I do? Where do I go?" They shook their head. "You don't run. Not yet. You follow the paths on this map. Find the others who might still be alive, and maybe, just maybe, you can stop them." A knock came at the door again, softer this time, hesitant. We both froze. The visitor's hand moved to their pocket, fingers curling around something small and cold. "Who?" I started, but the door swung open before I could finish. Two figures stepped inside, their faces half hidden in the shadows. I recognized one immediately, an acquaintance from earlier in 𝐾𝐨, a traveler who'd shared a story about his own narrow escape. The other was new, but there was something in their eyes, a coldness that didn't belong to any friendly stranger. The visitor tensed. "They're here," they whispered. "And they're not here to talk." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the web was closing tighter, and whatever came next wouldn't just be about stories anymore. It was about survival. The room seemed to shrink around us, and the map lay forgotten on the table, a fragile thread in a vast, dark network that had just begun to unravel. I had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The visitor's voice dropped even lower, barely audible above the distant creak of the old house settling. "We have minutes, maybe less." They moved fast. Their eyes darted toward the cracked window, where shadows pulled like ink against the fading light. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. There was no time to think through the details, only to act. "What do they want?" I asked, but the visitors shook their head. "Doesn't matter. It's what we have that counts. And they'll take everything if they get close." Their fingers brushed the edge of the map, tracing lines that now seemed less like geography and more like a trap. Suddenly, a sharp rap echoed on the front door, 3 quick, deliberate knocks. The visitor stiffened, signaling me to stay silent. Heart slamming against my ribs, I froze in place, the cold sweat making my palms slick against the wooden table. The door rattled as heavy hands forced it ajar. The visitor moved with a practiced grace, pressing me back into the shadows before slipping toward the entrance. Through the crack in the door, I caught a glimpse of figures, tall, clad in dark coats that swallowed the light, faces obscured beneath hoods. "We don't want to do this the hard way," one voice said, low and gravelly. "Open up. You've got what we need." "No," the visitor's voice was steady, resolute. "We don't have what you want." The sound of footsteps filled the narrow hallway, slow and deliberate. I pushed my back against the wall, the cold plaster biting at my skin as time seemed to dilate. The visitor returned silently, eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and fear. "We can't hold them off here," they breathed. "You need to come with me. Now!" Without waiting for my answer, they grasped my arm, pulling me toward the back exit. The owls groaned, as if protesting the intrusion. Outside, the air was thick with fog, muffling everything beyond a few feet. We moved quickly, shadows weaving between dead trees and tangled underbrush. I stumbled more than once, the uneven ground a cruel reminder of how little I knew about the coming night. Behind us, faint voices and the crunch of footsteps pursued relentlessly. "Where are we going?" I gasped, struggling to keep pace. "To the old mill. It's the only place left where we can disappear long enough to plan." The mill loomed in the distance, a silhouette against the dim glow of the moon. Its broken windows and sagging roof made it seem abandoned, but to me, it was a beacon of fragile hope against the darkness closing in. As we slipped inside, the visitor secured the door behind us, bolting it with a rusted latch. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of forgotten years, but it was safe, for now. I sank to the floor, trembling. The visitor crouched beside me, pulling a small, worn book from their coat. "This," they said, voice barely above a whisper, "contains the truth they want to bury. And it's the key to stopping them." My hands closed around the book, its weight suddenly heavier than any burden I'd ever known. Outside, the hunt continued, but inside the mill, a new battle was beginning, one fought not just for survival, but for the very soul of the story waiting to be told. The night outside the mill stretched on, cold and unyielding, but inside, time seemed to fracture. I'd barely slept, if at all. The book lay open between us, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was a collection of notes, testimonies, faded photographs, evidence painstakingly gathered, all pointing to a network of people who preyed on travelers like me. A chain of villages, each with their own friendly faces and warm smiles hiding a darker truth. The very friendliness that had drawn me in before was their trap. "We can't stay here much longer," the visitor said, voice low but urgent. "They'll circle back. It's only a matter of time." I nodded, trying to steady my breath. "Who are they? Why do they do this?" The visitor closed the book carefully, eyes hardening. "They're a group. Organized, ruthless. They use charm and stories to lure people, travelers, runaways, anyone who doesn't belong. Once someone disappears, the next friendly face arrives, new stories, new lies. It's a cycle." I swallowed hard, the pieces fitting together in a sickening way. The strange encounters I'd had, the mismatched details, the friends who vanished without a trace, they weren't coincidences. I was part of their pattern now. "We need a plan," I said, voice trembling but firm. "We can't just run forever." The visitor nodded. "There's a safe house, about 10 kilometers from here. Abandoned, but secure. If we can get there before they find us, we might have a chance to expose them." 10 kilometers, I echoed. "Through the forest?" "Yes. But the path is dangerous. They'll be watching the roads, the villages. We'll have to move carefully. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the mill's walls, we gathered our few belongings. The visitor tucked the book into their coat, the weight of it a constant reminder of what was at stake. We slipped out just as the fog began to lift, the woods eerily silent except for the distant call of a crow. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a warning. I kept my hand close to the visitor's, the only anchor in a world that felt unsteady and cold. Halfway through the forest, the crunch of footsteps behind us shattered the fragile calm. We froze, pressed against a tree trunk, hearts hammering. The voices were too close to be coincidence. "Keep moving," the visitor hissed. "Don't look back." We broke into a run, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us. The voices grew louder, stronger, closer. Panic clawed at my throat, but the visitor's grip tightened, pulling me forward. Suddenly, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking our path. A smile stretched too wide, eyes too bright. "Going somewhere?" the stranger asked, voice dripping with false warmth. The visitor stepped in front of me, posture tense but defiant. "We're not interested." "Let us pass." The stranger's smile faltered, replaced by something colder, sharper. "You don't get to choose." Before I could react, more figures emerged, encircling us. Friendly faces from the villages, now twisted, watching. The stories they told me were lies, their kindness a mask for something far more sinister. The visitor's hand brushed mine, a silent apology. "Stay close." The forest closed in, the hunters tightening their net. And in that moment, I understood this was no longer about escape. It was about survival, about fighting back against the darkness that hid behind every smile. As they closed in, I gripped the book hidden beneath my jacket, its secrets burning like fire in my hands. Somewhere in those pages lay the key, not just to my freedom, but to breaking the cycle before it claimed another lost soul. The underbrush cracked beneath heavy boots, the sound of grim metronome counting down the seconds until capture. I glanced at Carter, whose eyes flickered with a fierce determination I hadn't seen before. The hunt wasn't just physical, it was a test of will. The forest seemed to close around us, shadows lengthening, the dimming light casting everything in a sinister gray. I tightened my grip on the book, its worn leather cover rough against my palm. The words inside promised hope, but only if I could decipher them fast enough. Carter's hand squeezed mine briefly, grounding me. "We're not done yet," he murmured. His voice was low, steady, and it ignited something fierce inside me. Fear was a luxury we couldn't afford. Ahead, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a glint of metal, a flash of pale skin. The hunters were coordinating, signaling with sharp nods and whispered commands. They believed the forest was theirs, that we were just prey to be cornered and claimed. But I knew better. The forest held secrets too, ones older and darker than these men. And the book was our leverage. A sudden crack echoed, branches snapping, a sharp, urgent sound. One of the hunters stumbled, throwing the others into momentary confusion. Carter seized the chance, pulling me forward with renewed urgency. "Now," he hissed. We broke into a run, hearts pounding in unison, the pulse of the chase thrumming through our veins. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, thick with moss and the scent of earth and something else, something ancient. The book's pages seemed to pulse, as if alive, guiding us through the labyrinth of roots and shadows. My fingers traced the faded symbols, each one unlocking a fragment of truth, a whisper of power. We burst into a small clearing, the pale light filtering through the canopy like a promise. Carter shoved me behind a gnarled tree as the hunters closed in, voices sharp and angry now. But I wasn't helpless. The book was no longer just a secret, it was a weapon. I flipped it open, the pages glowing faintly in the twilight, and began to read aloud the words that would change everything. The hunters faltered, their confidence wavering as a low hum filled the air, rising from the very earth beneath our feet. The forest responded to the ancient incantation, roots twisting and branches weaving together, forming a barrier between us and the men who sought to drag us back into darkness. "This is just the beginning," I whispered, breathless but resolute. Carter nodded, eyes shining with newfound hope. We weren't just running. We were fighting back. And this time, the forest was on our side. Dawn spilled slowly over the forest, its light softening the jagged edges of the night's terror. I traced the symbols one last time, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming clarity that settled over me. The forest wasn't magic, not really. It was us, our will, our knowledge, our refusal to be prey. The book was a relic of a different kind of power, knowledge passed down to those who dared to claim it. And for the first time since I'd set out on this journey, I felt like I had a foothold. We moved cautiously out of the clearing, the barrier of roots and branches still faintly visible but no longer a living thing. The forest around us was quiet, deceptively so. I kept my senses sharp, expecting the hunters to regroup, to come again. But as the morning wore on, nothing stirred but the usual calls of distant birds and the rustle of leaves. We found a narrow path leading away from the thickest woods and followed it toward the nearest village, a place Carter said might offer some semblance of safety. As we walked, I thought back over the past weeks, the friends I'd made, the stories shared, the inconsistencies that had teased at the edges of my mind until they became impossible to ignore. The travelers who'd welcomed me, their smiles too eager, their histories too tangled. The disappearances that had followed in their wake, unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't just chance or coincidence. It was a network cold, calculated, and merciless, feeding on wanderers like me. When we reached the village, the sun was high, casting long shadows from the low stone houses. Carter and I slipped into a small cafe, its faded sign swinging in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of strong coffee and baked bread, a normalcy I hadn't felt in weeks. I ordered 2 cups, and as Carter sat across from me, I realized how much I'd relied on him, not just for survival, but for grounding. "We need to tell someone," I said quietly. "About everything. The hunters, the network, the book." Carter nodded, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "I agree. But we have to be smart. If this network is as deep as I think, they have eyes everywhere. We can't trust the local police or government officials." I swallowed, the weight of that truth settling heavily. The world wasn't a safe place, not for those who wandered too far from the map, not for those who carried secrets. But there was still a chance to fight back, to expose the darkness lurking beneath these remote villages. Over the next few days, Carter and I laid low, piecing together what we knew, using the book as a guide not to ancient magic but to a hidden ledger of places and names, clues left by those who had come before us. We reached out cautiously to trusted contacts we'd made along the way, travelers who had glimpsed the same unsettling patterns but had been too afraid to speak. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a blood-red glow, we gathered in a small circle at the back of the cafe. Faces were tense but determined. We shared our stories, our evidence, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, not the naive hope I'd carried when I first set out, but a tempered, hard-earned belief that we could make a difference. We decided to document everything, to send it to journalists and advocacy groups beyond these remote regions, people who could shine a light on the network and dismantle it. It was dangerous, and none of us knew what would come next. But silence was no longer an option. We owed that much to the missing, to the lost souls who had vanished without a trace. As I lay awake that night, the weight of the book beside me, I thought about how much I'd changed. Before this journey, I was searching for adventure, for meaning, for connection. Instead, I'd found a darkness I hadn't imagined, and within that darkness, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The fear that had once gripped me was still there, but it was tempered now by resolve. In the days that followed, Carter and I parted ways. He had family to return to, and I needed to keep moving, to keep searching for answers and survivors. But we promised to stay in touch, bound by the shared knowledge that we were not alone in this fight. As I packed my bag for the next leg of my journey, I paused before closing the book. The pages were worn, the ink faded, but the stories they held, the warnings, the clues, the fragments of truth, they were a lifeline. I tucked it safely inside my pack, a talisman of sorts, not against supernatural forces but against the very real horrors people could inflict on each other. Walking out of the village, the sun warming my back, I felt the forest behind me, silent, watching, indifferent. The world was vast and often cruel, but I was no longer just a lost traveler. I was a witness, a survivor, and a voice for those who could no longer speak. And I would keep moving forward, one step at a time, until the darkness was brought into the light. The path ahead twisted unpredictably, shadows lengthening as dusk approached. Yet, with each careful step, resolve hardened within me. No matter the obstacles or the silence pressing in, I would carry their stories, lighting the way through the encroaching night.